Ezekiel 33:3.
All right, happy Sabbath, everyone. Welcome to today's study. We'll be studying something called the universal world religion. Some of the topics we'll be looking at, and not in any particular order. We'll look at the pagan trinity, what is that, and how that compares to the word trinity that we find Christians using today. Because to be honest, there is absolutely no trinity described in the Bible. I was raised believing that there was a Christian trinity that was composed of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And then after studying the Bible more thoroughly, I realized that there is much more going on than a trinity, and we'll explore that. We'll take a look at the Masonic tracing board. We'll look at something called the triptych. The triptych is really interesting. In artwork, you'll take a look at some artwork that has to do with the triptych. Triptych has to do like a three-part design. So if we're talking like old artwork that you might have seen in Europe, it's when you see, for example, three panels where there's a left panel, a right panel, and a middle panel, and the art's broken up like that, and it's like three separate pictures. But we're also going to take a look at a triptych in regards to a trinity that came from pagan temples, and you can see it across the entire planet. And then we'll also examine something called universalism. So we're going to look at a lot of information from like the antediluvian age, that's before the flood. So this is all focusing on Genesis. We'll look at Jasher 2 and the Book of Jubilees. And we'll also take a look into King Nimrod, because there's a lot of connections between Cain and Nimrod and things that were passed on from before the flood to after the flood. Was everyone wiped out by the flood? Absolutely. But there was information that you can prove was passed from before the flood to after the flood. And that's going to explain why there were giants both before and after the flood. So we're going to start with the origins of the world religion. And you'll hopefully by the end of this, you'll see it's quite shocking. You're surrounded by this religion because it literally is across the entire planet, and they're just using different names in place of same ideas, just different cultures. You'll see it. We'll start with Genesis 11 because this is where it all points to. This is how it all started. Now the whole world had one language and a common form of speech. And as people journeyed eastward, they found a plain in the land of Shinar. Remember that here, where it said that people journeyed eastward, because this is important. And they settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." So they used brick instead of stone, and tar instead of mortar. The word tar is asphalt, and mortar is cement. "Come," they said, "let us build for ourselves a city, with a tower that reaches to the heavens, that we may make a name for ourselves, and not be scattered over the face of all the earth." So you can see that the people knew that when they were building this tower, whatever this was, they knew that their actions were going to lead to them being scattered everywhere, and we will prove that's true. Then the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the sons of men were building. And the Lord said, "If they have begun to do this as one people, speaking the same language," so you can see here, everyone in the world at this point, they spoke one language, "then nothing they devise will be beyond them. Come, let us." Now notice here, it's plural. It's not God just saying, "Come, I'm going to do this by myself." "Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them from there over the face of all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Just so you know, other books of the Bible will tell you that there were 70 angels. 70 angels came down, confused the tongues of the people, and there was immediately 70 different languages at that time. So you can imagine that whatever project they were doing in Babylon, at that point, if they were to talk about the project, there'd be 70 different ways to describe it. That is why it is called Babel. For there, the Lord confused the language of the whole world. And from that place, the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. So Babel is actually the Hebrew word for confusion. So when we say the Tower of Babel, we're actually saying the Tower of Confusion. The Book of Jasher 11. We're going to look at the Tower of Babel from another point of view. And Nimrod, son of Cush, was still in the land of Shinar, and he reigned over it and dwelt there, and he built cities in the land of Shinar. So just so you know, Jasher was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're talking 1947 to 1956. This was in the Qumran caves in Jerusalem, or outside Jerusalem. So this book was found with many other books of the Bible. It was found with Genesis, Exodus, A lot of the, actually, I think all of the Torah was found, and then the book of Isaiah and a couple other books, but they weren't found complete. They were found in fragments, but this book was found with them. So here we can see one detail we're already getting from the book of Jasher we don't get from Genesis. Nimrod had to do with the building of the tower. And these are the names of the 4 cities which he built. And he called their names after the occurrences that happened to them in the building of the tower. And he called the first Babel, saying that the Lord there confounded the language of the whole earth. And the name of the second, Erech, because from there God dispersed them. And the third he called Echid, saying that there was a great battle at that place. And the fourth he called Kalna, because his princes and mighty men were consumed there. And they vexed the Lord. They rebelled and transgressed against him. For those of you who don't know the name Nimrod, it's kind of a slang name. We're going to take a look at what the actual name was in history, because you won't find Nimrod in history books. You'll find a different name. But the name Nimrod, it's believed to mean he rebelled. Nimrod was responsible for the building of the Tower of Babel. So we can get that from the book of Jasher. And as I mentioned, Jasher was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was an archaeological find, probably the biggest archaeological find of modern history. And that was in Qumran caves outside Jerusalem from 1946 to around 1956, around that area. What is the meaning behind his name? We will rebel. This I took from thebump.com. Nimrod, baby name meaning. Nimrod as a boy's name is of Hebrew origin, and the meaning of Nimrod is we will rebel. Biblical Nimrod, the mighty hunter in Genesis. So we have a group of people that are led by this king, the first king. He was a mighty hunter, and one of the reasons why he was a king was because he was the biggest. And you'll find that when you're dealing with kings in the Bible, especially when you're looking, for example, the first king that Israel had, the first king that Israel had was King Saul. And King Saul, we know, was of tall stature. And the reason why is because David was of average height. We're talking King David. And when King David went to go fight Goliath, Saul tried to give David his armor, but the armor was way too big for David. So when people look at David, they think, oh, he was just a child. No, he wasn't a child. He just wasn't as big as Saul. They would always take their biggest individual in the ancient world, and that individual would be king. Because back in the day, the kings didn't just stay at home and let all the soldiers die. The kings used to actually go out and lead the battle. They would be in the front with the sword. And since they'd be big, they'd intimidate everyone else. And so Nimrod was called a mighty hunter. And we'll find that Nimrod was actually a giant. Do we have history of Nimrod outside the Bible? Of course we do. Nimrod, biblical figures. So we're looking at the Encyclopedia Britannica first. The description of Nimrod as a mighty hunter before the Lord is an intrusion in this context, but probably, like the historical notices, derived from some old Babylonian saga. However, no equivalent of the name has yet been found in Babylon or in other cuneiform records. So cuneiform was like one of the, I think it was the first language they found. Cuneiform script kind of looked like scratchings to me that looked like tent poles. In character, there is a certain resemblance between Nimrod and the Mesopotamian epic hero Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh is who a lot of scholars have connected with this character Nimrod. Nimrod means he who rebelled, but the name, it looks like, of the cultures that actually lived amongst this individual, Gilgamesh. Here's another example, Catholic Answers, Encyclopedia, Nimrod. You can see the spelling is slightly different. The reason why you'll find that there's slightly different spellings in English is because in Hebrew, there was no vowels, right? It was just consonants. So whether you stuck an E in there or you stuck an I in there, it's no big deal because, of course, all you were seeing in the Bible was NMRD. The name Nimrod has not yet been discovered amongst those found in cuneiform inscriptions. Okay, so Encyclopedia Britannica, Catholic Encyclopedia, they agree. And the attempts made by Assyriologists to identify him with historical or legendary personages known to us through these sources rest on more or less plausible conjectures. Thus, by some scholars, he is identified with Gilgamesh, the hero of the Babylonian epic. The reason why a lot of scholars lean towards Nimrod being Gilgamesh is because when you study Nimrod, you'll find out, like I said, there's giantism within his genes. So if you have a really big king in Mesopotamia who's a giant and he's commanding all these people, it makes it kind of easy to figure out. It's like, okay, you must be talking about Gilgamesh because Gilgamesh was a giant too. So what are the odds that we have two big kings existing at the same time in the same area that were both giants? They're probably the same person. Nimrod of the Bible is often equated in history books as Gilgamesh. If you're trying to figure out how big Gilgamesh was, this is one of the rock busts that were left behind, and he was an actual person according to Babylonian records. And you can see in his hand is a lion, and he's literally holding the lion with one hand and taming it. So he was a very large man. This isn't supposed to be a pup either. The reason why you can say this isn't like some kind of a lion cub is because it has a mane. So when the mane is grown, we're not really dealing with a little baby lion anymore. If we take a look at Orion, Orion is a constellation. We've looked at Orion before, but there's actually connection between Orion and Nimrod. Smith's Bible Dictionary says, the giant, a large and bright constellation of 80 stars. Now we're talking here not about Nimrod, but we're talking about the constellation Orion. It says 17 large ones, crossed by an equinoctial line. It's talking about the equator. It is named after a mythical personage of the Greeks, of gigantic stature and the handsomest man in the world. So we can see that Orion, the star cluster or the group of stars, was named after a Greek god Orion. So it's not just a constellation in the sky, it's also a Greek deity and the handsomest man in the world. And it says the Arabs called it the giant, referring to Nimrod, the mighty hunter who was fabled to have been bound in the sky for his impiety. Okay, so the Nimrod who built the tower, the Arabs called him the giant. The Greeks referred to the constellation Orion as the giant, and then they had a Greek god Orion, which was also a giant. So we're seeing a connection here between the heavens, and then a man on the earth. And then from the Arabs, we come to learn that there was a fable that Nimrod became someone who lived in the stars. So when we look at Orion's belt, remember, Nimrod in the Bible was called a mighty hunter before the Lord. Well, Orion's belt is a mighty hunter. That's the belt of the hunter. And the hunter will be depicted sometimes as an archer, sometimes as holding a shield or a sword, and he's fighting against the bull Taurus. So Orion is right across from Taurus the bull. And if you know your astronomy, Taurus the bull is where you find the constellation Pleiades, which is also mentioned in the Bible. Both Orion and Pleiades are mentioned in the Bible by name. So the constellation Orion, now we're looking at the Wikipedia. In old Hungarian tradition, Orion is known as magic, archer, or reaper. Now that's really interesting because in the Bible we have angels, and remember, we have angels that are in the abyss. We saw that from Jude, for example. After the flood, we saw angels were imprisoned. But we also know that when we look at some of the later books in the Bible, when we start talking about things like Revelation and prophecy, we see there's angels with sickles that come out of a temple. But it doesn't really say whether it's heaven. It just says they're coming out of a temple that's up above. Notice here that Nimrod or Orion was associated to the Reaper. And we have angels with sickles. And it's interesting because we have a Grim Reaper. The Grim Reaper, people thought is Father Time or Saturn. And so here we're seeing an association to Father Time or Saturn and Orion, which means there's a connection to Nimrod here being the Reaper. In recently discovered myths, he is called Nimrod, Hungarian Nimrod, the greatest hunter, father of the twins Hunar and Megor. Why would there be twins associated to Nimrod? It could possibly be that in the constellation Orion, if you look up in the air, you'll see two dogs. And a lot of people knew that the constellation Orion had two hunting dogs. Those two hunting dogs are Canis Major and Canis Minor. Canis Major is the big dog. Canis Minor is the little dog. If you study Egyptology, they believe that Canis Minor was associated to the god Horus, and Canis Major was associated to Isis. And it's also interesting that Canis Major, the big dog, that star Sirius exists in Canis Major. Sirius looks like where you get the names Isis, but also Osiris. It says the pi symbol and O stars on upper right form together the reflex bow or the lifted scythe. So we're either talking about a sickle or we're talking about a bow. It depends on your perspective when you look up at those stars. In other Hungarian traditions, Orion's belt is also known as the judge's stick. That's also very important. Don't forget that. So we can see here the things that are being associated to Nimrod. We get the idea of an archer, right? An archer holds a bow, or we get a reaper, and a reaper holds a sickle. But we're also seeing the judge's stick, and a judge holds a hammer. If we look in the Jewish encyclopedia under Orion, the Aramaic and Syriac names of Orion have been connected with the ancient Oriental tradition that Nimrod, who is called in the Bible a hero and mighty hunter, was fettered by God for his obstinacy in the building of the Tower of Babel, and he was set in the sky. So here we can see that again, there's this fable that after Nimrod had died, he had ascended to the stars. The story that I had heard was that his wife had claimed that he was some kind of a god and that he couldn't be destroyed. And then obviously when he died, it looked kind of stupid. So then the story changed where he ascended into the heavens and then he was continuing to live on, but up in the stars. And then from that point in time, my understanding is the wife took power in the kingdom. It is possible that the ancient Hebrews saw that this constellation, the figure of a man who was naturally regarded as extraordinarily tall and strong, exactly as the Greeks named it Orion, the Egyptians Sahu, and the ancient Hindus Trinaka. So here we have various religions that are all pointing to Nimrod. And the thing that's interesting is we've already studied in the past and we saw that the religion that was in ancient Iran, or in other words, Chaldea or Babylon, it made its way into the Indus Valley. Indus Valley is where India gets its name. And it was brought there by the Aryans, and the Aryans are your Iranians. So it's not surprising to see that we have a mythology for Nimrod and all these different nations, considering we can actually show the migration of the Aryans and how that information traveled into India and then farther east into deeper parts of Asia. So Gilgamesh, Nimrod, was a giant. Giants in Genesis 6:4 were the Nephilim. The Nephilim were a mixture of human and angels, so they were a hybrid. They were something that wasn't necessarily supposed to exist, because the angels came down, and we find out later in the book of Jude, they had sinned. Angels can sin. So if you think that angels are only good and they follow God, well, you have to remember there was Satan and his angels, and we can see in the ancient world there was this story that angels, they were sometimes called the Watchers. In some myths, I've even seen the word Grigori. They came down and they came amongst human women and they bore children to them, and those children were called the Nephilim. And books like the Book of Enoch, which was also found at the Dead Sea Scrolls, these children, the Nephilim, they were tall. They were very large. At some point, they got so tall, or some of them were so tall, that the people couldn't feed them anymore. And when these giants started to get hungry, they literally started to eat people. So in our fairy tales and fables like the Grimm's brothers, if you know Jack and the Beanstalk, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman, this idea of giants eating people goes all the way back here. And of course, since Jack and the Beanstalk, remember he's climbing up a tree to find the giant, that tree could likely be a reference to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And of course, since Nimrod died and ascended to the stars, and people used to worship the stars, you can see how these tales that the Grimm brothers had that made it through Europe, which were not necessarily invented by them, just recycled stories of old tribal stories having to do with things that happened in the past that are embedded in metaphors. Genesis 10:8 and 9. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who began to be a mighty one on the earth. That's really interesting because we see this terminology, a mighty one, show up in Genesis 6:4, specifically talking about the giants. So here's proof from just using the Bible itself that Nimrod was a giant. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. His kingdom began in Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Those cities match exactly what we saw in Jubilees. That was the book that was found in the 1940s. Genesis 6:4, let's do a comparison here. The Nephilim, so the giants, were in the earth in those days, and also after that. Okay, so what are these days? What period of time are we talking about? We're talking about before the flood. So if it says they were in the earth in those days, that means before the flood. Genesis 6:4 takes place specifically during the days of Jared, if you're curious. And then after that must have been referring to after the flood, which we saw. We saw it with Nimrod, but the most popular example that most people are familiar with is Goliath. Most people know the story of David and Goliath, so they'll say, yeah, the Bible does teach that there were giants after the flood. It says, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. I don't know how the churches read this line and pretend like some other type of creature had children with human women. They don't like this line because they don't necessarily have it fit with the rest of their church theology. So you'll find this line in Genesis. I mean, when have you went to church and ever heard anyone read from Genesis in the first place if it wasn't Adam and Eve? Most of the time when you're at church, it's such a focus on the New Testament and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Verses like these are hidden away and people never hear of them. So if you're like, oh, this is weird, I've never heard before that in the Bible there were angels that came upon human beings. That's because the churches don't typically teach the whole Bible, because the parts they don't like or the parts they can't explain, they just avoid them. The same were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. So here we get that word mighty men again. So there is a reference to the Nephilim and then being called mighty men, and there is a reference to Nimrod, and again the idea of he was a mighty man. He was mighty because he was tall in stature, and the Nephilim were tall in stature. Remember, they're not human beings, they're a mixture. There's something that wasn't necessarily supposed to exist, because we can see from the book of Jude that was a sin against the angels, and angels were actually locked in hell because of that sin. Again, this is New Testament, so why aren't the churches reading that? Nimrod, Gilgamesh, was a giant, a Nephilim. And if you kind of look behind the words here, you'll see this old hieroglyph that came from Mesopotamia. And again, it's a picture of Nimrod. He's wearing a king's crown, he's got a beard on, but again, he's picking up animals with one hand. He's gigantic. Nimrod was the king that built the Tower of Babel. So as far as we know, this is the first king in the world. We're going to look at a website here. It's called the Masonic Trowel. It says, to spread the cement of brotherly love and affection, that cement which unites us into one sacred band or society of brothers, among whom no contention should ever exist, but that the noble emulation of who can be the best work or best agree. So this is a Masonic website. I'm going to look for some quotes on here and just show you what they have to say about Nimrod. It's quite interesting because people don't really take much into consideration the fact that the nations they live in today, if you live in Canada, well, John A. Macdonald was a Freemason. He was appointed by the Queen to basically create Canada. So Confederation happened in 1867. If we look at the United States, it's no different. The founding fathers were also Freemasons. If we look at lots of areas of Europe, we'll find a lot of Masonic influence. So it's really interesting that we see that there's all this Masonic influence in the nations we live in today. Architecture that goes completely over our head, that seems to come from Egypt, we don't even seem to care about. And then we see quotes like this on Masonic resources about the Bible. Let's take a look. It says, the first Masonic Grand Master. Well, that sounds important. The universal sentiment of Freemasons of the present day, that's today, is to confer upon Solomon, the king of Israel, the honor of being their first Grand Master. So you can tell that the people who founded your nations, they obviously had a strong connection to the Bible. They said, at least in the present day, that Solomon was the first Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge. Kind of a big deal. If it's an imaginary book, why would these individuals that are the nation builders, the founders of nations, why would they associate a group of people or a book that was imaginary to their whole order? But the legend of the craft had long before, though there was a tradition of the temple in existence, given at least by suggestion, that title to Nimrod, the king of Babylonia and Assyria. Well, this is interesting. So they're saying the Grand Master wasn't actually Solomon from the Bible. It goes back even farther. And there was a temple that existed before Solomon's temple. But I thought Solomon's temple was the first temple connected to Israel. But Nimrod was building a very different temple. It had credited the first organization of the fraternity of craftsmen to him, in saying that he gave a charge to the workmen who he sent to assist the king of Nineveh in building his cities. That is to say, he framed for them a constitution. Isn't that funny? Because the founding fathers of the United States came up with a constitution. And last time I checked, Canada also has a constitution. So it looks like Nimrod was one of the first people to ever make a constitution. And in the words of the legend, this was the first time that ever Masons had any charge of his science. It was the first time that the craft was organized into a fraternity working under a constitution body of laws. So this is the first constitution ever in the world, right here. First king, first constitution, Masonic records. As Nimrod was the autocratic maker of these laws, it necessarily resulted that their first legislator creating laws with his unlimited and absolute governing power was also their first Grand Master. So who normally makes laws? Isn't that typically the judges? So the book of Judges would have been way after Nimrod. So Nimrod was also associated to what? The symbol of a judge. We just read it with the constellation Orion. So doesn't a judge make laws? A judge holds a gavel, does he not? This is getting very interesting. Did you know that if you go to a Masonic hall, the guy that's called the worshipful master, he sits in an area in the center of the room, well, at the front of the room. Front of the room in this case is the east, which coincidentally is where the sun seems to rise. And he holds a gavel in his hand. He holds a hammer in his hand. It's almost like we have the continuation of Nimrod through the worshipful master in the Masonic Lodge. But hey, I'm reading it from their own site. This is called the Matthew Cook manuscript. It's one of the oldest Masonic manuscripts written into prose. This is from the 15th century. So this was obviously rewritten from another source. Matthew Cook manuscript. Every reading Mason is aware that from the time of the original of the Cook MS constitutions, say 1400 AD, it has been handed down that hunter King Nimrod was a Grand Master. I've now given you two sources to point out that Nimrod is a Grand Master of Freemasonry. Well, that's so weird. That's the guy that built the tower to challenge God, but that's just fictitious, right? For some hundreds of years, our constitutions have asserted that Nimrod was a Grand Master and gave Masons a charge, which we still follow. Oh, that's presently. So in the world presently, Masons still have the charge from Nimrod to follow a constitution that he created, the first constitution. Our oldest Masonic manuscript, Regis poem, dated approximately 1390, traces Masonry not to Solomon, but to Nimrod and Euclid in a still earlier time. The oldest known Masonic text, the Old Charges, which dates at least as far back as 1400 AD, sets out a legendary heritage that begins with antediluvian. Antediluvian means pre-flood. Patriarch Jabal, who discovered geometry. The science is called Masonry, and wrote down his findings on pillars of stone. Okay, this is interesting. So now we're connecting back even farther than Nimrod. Nimrod was after the flood. Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, that was after the flood. But now we're talking about Jabal. And Jabal was one of the sons of Cain. So you're saying that the science called Masonry, which is bricklaying, right? Tower building, bricklaying. Isn't that what a tower is? They're laying down bricks to build a tower. So Masonry is actually even before Nimrod. It's going back to Jabal, which means Masonry is before the flood. It says that Jabal wrote his findings, his science, down on pillars of stone. So he recorded it somewhere. After Noah's flood destroyed all of human civilization, the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, if you're not familiar with Hermes, he's known as the god Mercury to the Romans. The Egyptians called him Thoth. Rediscovered this knowledge and passed it on in a lineage that includes Nimrod. That's interesting, because if you get into the occult and you study the story of Atlantis, Atlantis sounds a lot like the flood. It sounds like the people of Atlantis was really just a pagan version of the story of Noah's Ark, but you're not hearing about Noah. You're just hearing about the cities that were drowned, or in other words, Atlantis, somewhere that was super advanced. Now, why would Atlantis have been super advanced? Well, if Atlantis was the Old Testament prior to the flood. We're talking Genesis before the flood, so Genesis 7 and back. Why would they have been so highly advanced? Well, didn't angels come down in Genesis 6 and they came to human women? What if angels taught women things that they knew from the heavens? Wouldn't that make a very advanced culture? I mean, instead of man innovating and discovering stuff and making a wheel out of stone, out of trial and error, what if some heavenly being just came down and told you how to do it? So Masonry claims that Jabal, before the flood, wrote down his discoveries in geometry. So the science of Masonry, right here, here's Jabal. Actually, I have the arrow pointing in the wrong spot. That's Jubal. Jubal actually had to do with music. So music was associated to Jubal. Directly above Jubal, see where it says Jabal? Jabal is the one that had to do with geometry. But if you look, you'll see there's two bloodlines here. On the left-hand side, it's actually the same bloodline. It's Cain and Abel, right? We had Cain who slayed Abel. Cain's bloodline, in other words, the son who murdered his brother, down that bloodline is where Masonry traces back its history. That's pretty far back. That's before the flood. If we're talking Cain and Abel and people today who founded your countries, tracing their history back to descendants of Cain and Abel, that's pretty impressive. On the other side, we see Seth. So if we look on the side of Seth, see where it says Mahalalel, and then beneath that, Jared? Jared is where Genesis 6:4 took place. That's when all of a sudden we had angels and human beings, women, come together and then make these Nephilim. And then we can see that beneath Jared on the side of Cain, we have Lamech, who had two wives. That's the first polygamist in the Bible. So in Cain's bloodline, we have some interesting stuff. We have an Enoch that's under Cain, the same we have an Enoch that's under Seth. And we have Lamech, who has two wives. And then we have Jabal, Jubal, and then Tubal Cain. These three names, Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal Cain, extremely important in Freemasonry. As a matter of fact, Masonry doesn't talk about this line of Seth at all. All of their history is really focused on this left-hand side that's under Cain. Genesis 4:9-16. And the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I do not know," he answered. "Am I my brother's keeper?" "What have you done?" replied the Lord. "The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed and banished from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." I'm going to give you a hint. I've heard in the occult what happened to Cain, or what happened to Abel. You can find from some books of the Bible, some of the deuterocanonical books, like these extra books like Jasher and Jubilees, that Cain killed his brother Abel by hitting him in the head with a rock. Okay, but the body, notice here in Genesis 10, you don't actually find out where the body is. His blood cries from the ground, but like, what did Cain do? Did he bury him? The rumor in the occult is that Cain ate his brother. Cain ate Abel. In other words, Cain and Abel, cannibal, cannibal. The word cannibal, Cain and Abel, you can see it right there. He ate his brother. That's the story in the occult. And that's why there was no body to be found. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield its produce to you. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. But Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, this day you have driven me from the face of the earth, and from your face I will be hidden. I will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." "Not so," replied the Lord. "If anyone slays Cain, then Cain will be avenged sevenfold." And the Lord placed a mark on Cain that no one who found him would kill him. That's interesting, the sevenfold piece. I'll point out the reason why. Because today, obviously, we have people who've rejected Christ that were actually from the bloodline of Abraham. Who are those people? Well, in the New Testament, we see there's Pharisees and Sadducees. Those were Jews. And they both rejected Christ. Here we can see that Cain is being avenged sevenfold and marked. And what's interesting is, what was the mark of God or the seal of God from the book of Revelation? Well, that points us back to the Old Testament, to the Torah. What's the seal of God that the locusts were looking for? The 10 Commandments. If later you don't want to be harassed by something that comes out of the pits of hell, you need to follow the 10 Commandments. Otherwise, the locusts are coming to harass you. So then when we look at Cain, Cain also has a mark. And this mark has something to do with the number 7. Well, that's interesting because when I look at today's Pharisees, which we're going to see has a connection to Cain, The Pharisees have the 7 Noahide laws. In other words, they took the 10 commandments, subtract 3. Why the first 3? Well, because if you remove the first 3, you can switch to a different God. So in other words, don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't lie. Those things are all still there. The Sabbath is actually still there too. What was removed though? Idol worship would be one. Have no other gods before me, and don't take the Lord's name in vain. Those 3 disappeared. 7 Noahide laws. So Cain went from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Where's the land of Nod? And where is Eden? Where was Eden located on earth? Remember, Eden is a place on earth, but it's also a place that overlapped with the heavens. Heaven and earth used to actually be overlapping. If you ever seen the symbol of a Vesica Pisces, think of the MasterCard symbol or the Gucci symbol, where you see 2 circles kind of overlapping and the space in the center. That's how heaven and earth used to be. When Adam and Eve were in Eden, they were able to see heavenly beings as well as be on a physical plane. It's different now because there was a fall. There was a separation.
So in the Bible, the ideas of heaven and earth are ways of talking about God's space and our space.
So I understand our space really well. We live here. There's trees, rivers, mountains. But my understanding of God's space gets a little fuzzy.
And what we do get in the Bible are images trying to help us grasp God's space, which is basically inconceivable to us.
So these are 2 very different types of spaces.
Yes, they're different in their nature, but here's what's really interesting is that in the Bible, these are not always separate spaces. So think of heaven and earth as like different dimensions that can overlap in the same exact space.
So we talk a lot about going to heaven after we die, but this idea of heaven and earth overlapping, we don't talk a lot about that.
Which is kind of crazy because the union of heaven and earth is what the story of the Bible is all about. How they were once fully united and then driven apart, and about how God is bringing them back together once again.
So let's go back to the beginning, where heaven and earth, they're completely overlapping.
Yeah, this is what the Bible's description of the Garden of Eden is all about. It's a place where God and humanity dwelt together, perfectly no separation, and humans then partner with God in building a flourishing, beautiful world and so on.
But as humans, we wanted to do things a different way. We wanted God out, and we wanted to create a world apart from him.
Yeah, so we have these 2 spaces now. And the Bible actually uses lots of different kinds of words and phrases to refer to these 2 spaces to make a clear distinction.
So you've said that these spaces can overlap, though. So explain how that works.
Yeah, this is where we have to start talking about temples. Because in the biblical world, you experience God's presence by going to a temple. That's where heaven and earth overlap.
Now, there are 2 types of temples described in the Bible. One is a tabernacle, basically a tent that was built by Moses. And the other was this massive building made by Solomon.
And these temples were decorated with fruit trees and flowers and images of angels and all kinds of gold and jewels and so on. And these are designed to make you feel like you're going back to the garden. And at the center of the temple was a place called the Holy of Holies, which was like the hot spot of God's presence.
Now we can go and be with God again.
But not so fast, because the temple also creates a problem. So God's space is full of his presence and goodness and justice and beauty, but human space is full of sin and injustice and the ugliness that results.
So how do these spaces overlap if they're so different and they're in conflict with each other?
This was resolved through animal sacrifice.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. What do animal sacrifices have to do with this?
Yeah, the idea is this. Animal sacrifices, somehow they absorb the sin when the animal dies in your place. And it creates a clean space, so to speak, where you are now free to enter into the temple and be in God's presence.
Okay, so if I'm an Israelite and I live in Jerusalem, I might be able to be in God's presence. But you said the story of the Bible is all of heaven and earth reuniting.
Right. So we have to keep going in the story where we come to Jesus in the New Testament. And in the Gospel of John, we hear this claim that God became human in Jesus and made his dwelling among us. Now, this word dwelling is really curious. It means he set up a tabernacle among us. And so what John is claiming right here is that Jesus is a temple. He is now the place where heaven and earth overlap.
What's interesting about Jesus is that he isn't staying in this safe, clean space. He's running around hanging out with sinners. He's healing people of their sicknesses and forgiving people of their sins.
He's basically creating little pockets of heaven where people can be in God's presence, but he's doing it out there in the middle of the world of sin and death.
And he keeps telling everyone that the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
And he even told his followers to pray regularly that God's kingdom come and that his will be done here on earth just as it is in heaven.
But a lot of people are threatened by Jesus and they kill him, which seems to spoil this whole plan to reunite heaven and earth.
But we have to go back to a scene earlier on in Jesus' story where John the Baptist saw Jesus and said, "Behold, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world."
So Jesus isn't just talked about as being a temple, he's also talked about as being the temple sacrifice.
Yeah, so the cross is now the place where Jesus absorbs sin to create a clean space that is not limited like animal sacrifices. Jesus' sacrifice has the power to keep spreading and reuniting more and more of heaven and earth.
And this is all really great, but it leaves one big question in my mind, which is, what happens when I die? Don't I just fly over to God's space to be with Jesus?
Yeah, so a few times in the New Testament, we learn that Christians will be with Jesus in heaven after they die, but that is not the focus of the Bible story. The focus is on how heaven and earth are being reunited through Jesus and will be completely brought together one day when he returns. So in the book of Revelation, we get this beautiful image of the Garden of Eden, now in the form of a city, coming to end the age of sin and death by redeeming all of human history in a renewed creation. And God's space and human space completely overlap once again.
So if Eden was once an overlapping of heaven and earth, where is Eden located today? So we saw in the video, for those of you who don't understand animal sacrifice, that's exactly what it was about. When you would do something contrary to what God wanted you to do, you would cause a division between him and yourself. He can't be around people that are doing the opposite of what he desires. So it's kind of like this. If you're living in your parents' house and you don't follow your parents' rules, what do? They kick you out. So you had heaven and earth overlapping. When all of a sudden people decided they were going to do it their own way, there was a separation, there was a fall. In order to bring that separation together again, animal sacrifice was the answer. Blood was the answer. So the idea was this. It's like, well, why blood? I don't understand. When you think about it, if I was to say, I'm going to inflict violence on you if you don't do X, Y, Z, isn't that typically a pretty good threat in the human world? Absolutely. So then if I was to tell you that sin leads to death, if you don't listen to me, you're going to die. Doesn't that typically work the exact same way as humans that are using extortion or some means of violence to get you to do what they want? The idea was that God didn't want to be harsh with you. It's the same thing as your father. Your father doesn't want to be harsh with you, but there's situations where children just don't listen. And then what do you have to do? You have to scold them. This is what that is. So there's a separation, kicking them out of the house, and the scolding. To reconcile things and bring things back together, the answer was blood. So the idea was, since sin leads to your death, something else needs to die in your place. That's the logic behind it. And so then the blood of the animals was an atonement for the people to once again come back in God's space. That's just how it works. And so, of course, animal sacrifice ended with Christ. That's when all of a sudden Christ was now able to be that last sacrifice. And then we say this terminology in the New Testament, we see you have to be in Christ. I don't get it. How can I be in Christ? Well, start off with his character. If you're not acting anything like him, you're definitely not in him. We're talking about someone who died, resurrected in the flesh, and then ascended to heaven. So now he's a spiritual being. So how do you be within a spiritual being? What does the word spirituality even mean? Spirituality has to do with your mind. When the Holy Spirit renews you, it's renewing you through your mind. So it's circumcised, you're uncircumcised in your heart, you're making it unhard, and then your mind is being renewed. And then you can be in Christ Jesus through your thoughts and actions. Through your thoughts, obviously, you can come into contact through prayer, and through your actions, you show that you know him. So now you can see what this idea of is heaven and earth coming back together being the ultimate goal. That's why when you die, you don't immediately just bounce up to heaven. You have to wait for his return. What is he returning with? Well, they're going to bring the new kingdom. When the new kingdom comes, what happens? The old kingdom is gone. You just have the new kingdom merged together again. There's a purification. So now we have to answer the question of, where was the earthly part of the kingdom? A lot of people just thought Eden was someplace, near heaven and we can't get there anymore. It's like, no, there was a physical location that overlapped with the heavenly location. Live science. This is from 2019, October. Scientists think they found the mitochondrial Eve's first homeland. A lot of people have seen this, that we all come from one human ancestor. Scientists figured it out, so now it's official, right? In recent years, science found Eve. By studying the genomes of more than 1,200 indigenous Africans living in the southern part of the continent today, the team pieced together a history of one of the oldest DNA lineages on Earth, a collection of genes called L0. So that's called a DNA Y haplogroup. We studied that when we were looking at the Gadites, right? The Native Americans that weren't native to America that have the R1 and QM3 haplogroup. Well, the oldest Y haplogroup is called L0. And this is going back to our Eve. That means whether you're black, white, Chinese, Indian, we can prove you all came from one common human ancestor, which matches the story of the Bible, which is passed down maternally through the mitochondria. Okay, so mitochondria, again, we're talking DNA, and maternally means we're talking about the mother. So yeah, they found Eve. Once they located the oldest DNA, finding Eden became no longer a fantasy, because chances are where the oldest DNA is, unless they traveled and migrated really, really far, Eden would probably be around there somewhere. The Saturday Standard. This is a year ago. Scientists discovered Garden of Eden in Africa. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone who reads Genesis very carefully. A single Garden of Eden located where humans are believed to have originated has been discovered in Africa. DNA analysis has identified the cradle of mankind for our ancient ancestors was Botswana, in the middle of south of the continent. So we're looking at more southern Africa. This is where they believe that this is Eden, because this is where they found this old ancient mitochondrial DNA that came from a maternal ancestor. Where did Cain go after killing his brother Abel? Genesis 4:13. But Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, this day you have driven me from the face of the earth, and from your face I will be hidden. I'll be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Not so, replied the Lord. If anyone slays Cain, then Cain will be avenged sevenfold. And the Lord placed a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Okay, so if we're looking at Africa as being the original place where everyone started, what's east of Africa? And remember, he was a wanderer. He traveled pretty far. Now, if you go east of Botswana, you're going to end up in the ocean. So he must have went northeast. Genesis 4:17 says, and Cain had relations with his wife. You can find out who his wife is in another book, because Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. It says so in the book of Genesis. And she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Then Cain built a city and named it after his son Enoch. So Cain had a child called Enoch, and he built a city after him. Can we find a land in the east, an early, maybe first city that's named after Enoch? Where is the city of Enoch? Where was the first city in the world? Genesis for ordinary people. This article is titled Cain's City. Question, we read in Genesis 4:17 that Cain knew his wife and conceived and born Enoch when he built a city. He called the name of the city after his son Enoch. Which city was that, and what's the background and history? The city of Uruk started sometime before 4000 BC. Uruk is a strong contender for the city that Cain built. The city of Uruk was the largest city in the world at its height, 40,000 residents and about 80,000 people living in surrounding areas. City-states were a feature of the southern Mesopotamia. Hence the need felt by Moses to mention Cain's city. So what's interesting is if you know your ancient history, you know that ancient Iraq is really the cradle of civilization, right? Mesopotamia, at least that's where we find all the stuff. Africa, it's a little bit more difficult, but we can find lots of rock busts and temples, and you'll find that in Iraq, Iran, those areas used to be part of a place called Samaria. Samaria is where you're going to find Uruk. And Samaria, if you talk to not even biblical scholars, just scholars in general, they believe it was the first place in the world, obviously outside of Africa. But Samaria was the first place that we found stuff that people built. What came after Samaria? Acadia. What came after Acadia? Chaldea or Babylonia. So that's where we start to get into Nimrod. What's interesting is when they would build temples in this area of the world, they would build a new temple on top of the existing temple. So when they found these different temples in Iraq, Iran, under Saddam Hussein, what they noticed was when they did a dig farther down, they would find an even older temple beneath that temple. And the oldest temples you'll find, Uruk. Iana was a district in Uruk that centered around the temple to Inanna at Uruk. That's very interesting. Now we know one of the god, or in this case, goddesses, that are one of the oldest goddesses ever worshipped. It looks like people were worshiping an ancient goddess at Uruk. And Inanna, just so you know, Inanna later, obviously it wasn't in the beginning, later in time, the priests who cut off their genitals, they did it for Inanna. They were called eunuchs. If we place a K at the end of Iana, we see Eonic, which looks like Enoch, a point made by R.J. Fisher, author of Historical Genesis. L.A. Waddell, another scholar, who studied Sumerian and wrote Makers of Civilization in Race and History, translated Uruk as Enoch from the Sumerian Unug. He writes, the city of Enoch we have seen is admitted by all the leading biblical experts to be identical with the city of Unug or Unuk, and laterally Uruk of the Sumerians, and identical with Erech of the later Hebrew Old Testament texts. We have two different scholars, actually we have more than two, but we have two different ways of coming to the conclusion that Uruk was named after Enoch. According to the Sumerian king list, I'm going to try to pronounce this, Mishki-Angasher was the city of Uruk's first ruler, and the man whom under it was built. If we look carefully at the name Mishki-Angasher, we may see a similarity between Cain and Kian Mishangasher. So we can see Cain and we can see Uruk at the city. And keep in mind, where is Uruk? Where is Samaria? Where is Babylon? Where is Iran? Iran is east of Africa. The city of Uruk in ancient Samaria, which is the oldest city in the world, is most likely the city that Cain built for his son Enoch. Now let's bring this back to Masonry, because we drift a little bit far from Freemasonry. Remember, the Masons say we can take our history and take it all the way back before the flood. They take it to Nimrod, no problem, multiple texts. But then they said, well, Nimrod, he got it from somewhere else. It came to us after the flood. It was Hermes Trismegistus. It was the Egyptian god Thoth. It was the Roman god Mercury. He brought us this information. I found this. This is called the Museum of Freemasonry. Tubal Cain. Tubal Cain is a person mentioned in the Hebrew Bible in Genesis 4:22. He was a descendant of Cain, the son of Lamech and Zillah, the brother of Nama and the half-brother of Jabal and Jubal. Genesis 4:22 says that Tubal Cain was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, or an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Although this may mean he was a metalsmith, a comparison with verses 20 and 21 suggests that he may have been the very first artificer in brass and iron. T.C. Mitchell suggests that he discovered the possibilities of cold forging native copper and meteoric iron. Tubal Cain has even been described as the first chemist. Very interesting. Masons seem to have a lot of connections to Cain and his children before the flood. Why is that? This is the Iowa Grand Lodge. So Grand Lodge of Iowa website, not just a man, a Mason. I found this article on their website kind of hidden away off of the menu. I found it by accident. Tubal Cain, it's a PDF. Here's the link at the bottom if you want to read it yourself. So the question says, why does Tubal-Cain, let me zoom in a bit. Why does Tubal-Cain, an artificer in metals, play such a prominent role in our ritual? Why was not a builder chosen, or at least someone connected with the art of building? Remember, Nimrod built the Tower of Babel. They said that Nimrod was the grand master of Freemasonry before Solomon. Why did they choose Tubal-Cain in so many of their rituals when he wasn't a builder? That's the question. Here's the answer. For a full answer to this, we have to go back to the oldest documents of the craft, the MS Constitutions. But first, we should glance at the biblical background to the story, which appears in Genesis 4, and then we have 16 to 22. So notice here that we have this constant theme in Masonry to keep pointing back to the Bible. It makes the people who live in the nations of the world look pretty stupid today when you find that the people who founded your nations, they accept the Bible. Well, you keep watching these documentaries on TVs making fun of the Bible. It's just hilarious to me. If Nimrod built the first nation, or we look at Cain, actually, Cain built the first nation, and then Nimrod later built a nation, one of the greatest nations, which was Babylon. Isn't it kind of coincidental to see that today, in the present day that we live, Canada, the United States, and many other nations were founded by Freemasons? I see a theme there in ancient history. The Bible tells how Cain, having murdered his brother, escaped from Eden to Nod, where his wife bore him a son, Enoch. Cain then built, or started to build, a city, and knowing himself to be accursed, he named it after his son Enoch. So he didn't name the city Uruk after himself. He named it after his son because his name was shamed, right? He was cursed. The succeeding verses then recount the birth of Enoch's grandson, Lamech, with the story of Lamech's 2 wives and their 4 children, Jabal, the father, or the originator of the science of tending flocks. That's interesting. So you're telling me that Jabal was a shepherd. Jabal was a shepherd. Abel was a shepherd. It says Abel had been a shepherd, but Jabal had widened the class of animals that could be domesticated. Jabal, the founder of art of music. So we have Jabal, which is the founder of tending flocks. In other words, he kind of carried up where Abel left off after Abel died, and he got even greater at it. And then we had Jubal, who is the founder of music. So Jabal actually has 2 things that he's known for. He's known for geometry, and he's known for tending flocks. And Jabal was known for music. So in Masonry, if we're going by the bloodline of Cain, they have a rich history in different types of crafts. Tubal-Cain, inventor of the forge, skilled in brass and ironwork and in cutting instruments. Nama, the Old Testament text, simply names her as Lamech's daughter, but a Jewish tradition arose that was well established among historians of the Middle Ages that she was the inventor of the arts of weaving and other related skills. So much for the background, amplified slightly with notes from early commentaries. The story, insofar as it concerns our present ritual, is derived from the earliest pillar legend incorporated in historical portion of MS Constitutions, our old charges. So the rituals that Masons do today go all the way back to here, Tubal-Cain. It tells how the 4 children of Lamech, fearing the world was to be destroyed by fire or flood, took counsel together and decided to inscribe all the sciences that had been founded upon 2 pillars, one of marble and the other of lacerus, which is a clay brick, because one would not burn and the other would not sink in water. So here we can see that Cain's bloodline knew the end of the world was coming, according to Freemasons. And so what they did was to preserve all the stuff they learned, right? They were good at brass work and ironwork, music, weaving, to geometry, clay building, right? Like, in order to preserve all this knowledge, what they do? They made 2 pillars. One pillar was made of one substance, so they said, well, this pillar won't sink. So if God decides to flood the world, this pillar will float. It's made of a clay brick. What if God tries to destroy the world by fire? Oh, we'll use this marble one, because marble won't be destroyed by fire. And we will etch into these 2 pillars our knowledge. Tubal-Cain was able to preserve the knowledge of his lineage, in other words, from Cain's line. This is before the flood, because remember, no one survived on the side of Cain. The only people that survived on the side of Seth were Noah and his sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, and their wives. That's it. That's it. Everyone else in the world was killed. So the way that they were able to preserve their knowledge was through Tubal-Cain. The Masonic sciences were passed down through Cain's descendants by Tubal preserving their knowledge on 2 pillars before the flood. 1 pillar of marble that would not burn, 1 pillar made of clay brick that would not sink. So clearly they knew that destruction was coming. They just didn't know how. And so they made 2 pillars, one to be fire resistant, one to be water resistant. That's very smart. We know that the story of the flood, though, means that the one left behind, or the one that would have to be found after the flood, must have been the clay brick one, because the marble one would have been sunk somewhere. This is a continuation from the Grand Lodge of Iowa. There is no need to discuss the accuracy of the legend. Look how confident they are. They say, we know this is true. Josephus gave one version of it in his Antiquities, and the story reappears in the writings of many medieval historians. They're like, we can tell, based on how many cultures repeated the story, we know this is true. So how come everyone in North America doesn't? How come we all think the Bible's fake? Meanwhile, the people that founded our nations know these stories of knowledge before the flood? Wow, it makes us look stupid. The earliest Masonic version appears in Cook MS of 1410, where the compiler had clearly attempted to reconcile several conflicting accounts, but Cook MS legend was repeated regularly with variations in all subsequent versions of MS constitutions. These 2 pillars, here's the important part, not Solomon's. I'll repeat that. These 2 pillars, not, how could they be Solomon's pillars? These were way before Solomon's temple. We're talking before the flood. These 2 pillars, not Solomon's, were the earliest pillars in the legendary history of the craft. Masonry is often referred to as the craft. And our story then goes on to recount how the world was saved in Noah's flood, and how the science of Masonry, listen to this, traveled through the east, from the east through Egypt, into Europe, and was finally established in England. For those of you who don't know, the Masonic Lodge, the Grand Lodge of England, that was 1717, City of London, a separate city-state. You know, the City of London has an Egyptian obelisk. So if you don't think that they brought their information from Egypt, then you explain to me why in the City of London you have this big obelisk. In Rome, you have this big obelisk. And then the founding fathers in the United States, did they not put up this thing called the Washington Monument? It's a big obelisk. So it looks like they actually did take their knowledge from Egypt. But they say, hey, it's way before Egypt, you guys. Before Egypt was Babylon. What was before Babylon? Well, that's where we start to get into the story of Atlantis. Ah, I see. You're talking about before the flood. Before the flood, Tubal-Cain recorded something on 2 pillars, and then we have after the flood, someone must have found it. The legend surrounding Tubal-Cain can be found in the Book of Jubilees. So now it's not just Masonic legend anymore. We can actually prove it based on biblical books. Jubilees was found at the Qumran Caves between 1947 and 1956, along with the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as many fragments of the books of the Bible, such as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and many more. So let me get this straight. We have all these books from the Old Testament. We find this book of Jubilees, and you're telling me we're not supposed to accept it? I wouldn't say that it's Holy Spirit inspired, because if it was, we probably would have had it before. But the fact that we have it now, and it showed up with these other books, I would say if we can read the Book of Jubilees and it gives us better insight on the Bible, and we don't look at the lines that necessarily contradict, I think that'd be a very good way to go about reading a book that wasn't inspired by the Holy Spirit. Jubilees chapter 8. In the 29th Jubilee, in the first week, 1373 a.m., and that's Annu Mundis. That's I believe that's a Masonic measurement of time. In the beginning thereof, Arpachshad took to himself a wife, and her name was, Rajua, the daughter of Susan, the daughter of Elam. And she bare to him a son in the 3rd year of this week, and called his name Cainum. Sounds a lot like Cain. That's funny, because we have a child called Cain before the flood, and then we have a name that's very close to Cain after the flood. Look what Cainum found. And the son grew, and his father taught him writing, and he went to seek for himself a place where he might seize for himself a city. And he found a writing which former generations had carved on the rock. I'll repeat that again. And he found a writing which former generations, what would former generations be if we're looking at Elam? Because Elam, we're talking not too long after the flood here. If you look at the lineage coming from Noah. So you're telling me that one of the children found something from before the flood carved on a rock? Take a guess what that was. And he read what was thereon, and he transcribed it and sinned owing to it. For it contained the teaching of the watchers, in accordance with which they had used to observe the omens of the sun and moon and the stars and all the signs of heaven. Now it gets super interesting. Now we actually know what exactly the Masons were writing down and where it came from. How was Cain's bloodline with Tubal-Cain, Jubal? Why were they so smart? Why were they able to make these advanced things like why were they so advanced in geometry? Why were they so advanced in music? Why were they so advanced in metalsmithing? How did they do it? It tells you right here. It says it contained the teaching of the watchers. Oh, so they didn't figure it out by themselves. The angels provided them with it, because we know from the book of Enoch, the watchers are who? That's Genesis 6:4. Those were the angels that came and had sex with human women and then had these children called the giants. So then mankind had learned these advanced crafts, not through their own ingeniousness. They learned it from fallen entities. And it says, in accordance with which they used to observe the omens of the sun and moon and stars and all the signs of heaven. That's interesting, because we saw that there was sun and moon worship that was showing up in Deuteronomy. And today we can see there's solar religions, lunar religions. Why do you think the Asians have a Lunar New Year? And he wrote it down and said nothing regarding it, for he was afraid to speak to Noah about it, lest he should be angry with him on account of it. Okay, so let's get this straight. A child finds something that was left behind from before the flood. It was left there by who? Well, the sons of Cain. What did it have on it? Information that came from the watchers, from the angels. And it had information about the sun, the moon, the stars. So in other words, worship of foreign gods. So then when we hear it from Nimrod's point of view, Nimrod said, well, it came from Thoth. It came from Hermes Trismegistus. It came from Mercury, but Mercury is a star. So are you telling me that this, whatever was found on this rock, it had to have something to do, I'm assuming, with the sun, the moon, and the stars? It had something to do with what later became the worship of the stars. And we can see that was a huge problem in the Old Testament, where people were involved in star worship. Today, we're living in 2021, and people are still reading their horoscope. They're still trying to figure out, based on the position of the stars, what their future is going to be. It's called divination, okay? Christians don't practice divination. So obviously this horoscope thing that's in the paper still today goes all the way back to this. The watchers are the angels from Genesis 6:4. We can tell by cross-referencing with the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch was also found at the Qumran caves in the 1940s. Cain's children recorded the knowledge of the sons of God, the watchers, the angels, on 2 pillars. And when the world was flooded, one of those pillars obviously made it into the hands of a descendant of Noah. Because remember, everyone was wiped out except for Noah's descendant. And this child found what? He found the pillar, and he didn't tell his parents. So is this how the giants continued from before the flood to after the flood? And here was the interesting thing about the giants. When you start looking at before the flood, the word we saw was Nephilim. When we look after the flood, the word was Raphaim, and it was different. Tubal-Cain recorded the knowledge which was passed down through Freemasonry. This is why the name Tubal-Cain is so important in Masonic rituals and the password to enter Masonic lodges. You want to go to the Masonic lodge today? I don't say you crash it, but I will tell you that still to this day, if you come in that door, you have to give the password to the guy who guards the door. What's the password? Tubal-Cain. Why is it the password? Because the Masonic lodges wouldn't even exist if Tubal-Cain hadn't have put this information on a pillar. All of their rituals, all of their secret knowledge wouldn't exist without it being recorded by Tubal-Cain. Makes sense why it's so important now. As a matter of fact, someone within our Bible study group, their grandfather had this name written down on a piece of paper, and we showed you that in a former lecture, Tubal-Cain. So if we take a look here, here's the 2 pillars of Masonry. This is called the Masonic Tracing Board. I told you at the beginning, we're going to look at the tracing board. This is called, you can call it the pillars of Freemasonry. They'll say, oh, it's the pillars of Solomon's temple. But we know that this is much older than Solomon's temple. They just call it the pillars of Solomon's temple. What this is, it's the pillar of the sun and the pillar of the moon. I'm not guessing, because it's a sun over one side and a moon over the other. So that means that one pillar that was obviously made of marble, And the other pillar that was made out of this floating material, which was like this brick clay, well, they must represent these two pillars. So we've got moon. And if you notice, look at the moon. The moon's got a bunch of stars beside it. Why doesn't the sun have stars beside it? Well, because there's not stars in the daytime. No, it's deeper than that. If you look at the moon, you'll notice there's 7 stars. Why are there 7 stars? Where do the 7 stars fit? Well, the 7 stars, quite interestingly enough, they have to do with the constellation Pleiades, the 7 sister stars that are up above your head. As a matter of fact, let me give you an example of how you're slowly being indoctrinated without realizing it. You ever hear of the drink 7-Up? Yeah, it's 7 stars up above your head. Remember that there was the cool spot, the little red spot that wore shades? Yeah, well, there's a star that goes red and then it goes blue and it changes over time. And different astronomers have recorded a star that goes from red to blue. That's the cool spot. Cool denotes cold, and then the spot was the red, right? He was a red spot that was called cool. So it's blue and red mixed together. It's the joke. It's an inside joke. So we've got the moon associated to what looks like the constellation Pleiades. And what's interesting about Pleiades? Well, look at these two pillars. They sit across from each other, right? What's the pillar of the sun about? Well, the pillar of the sun has something to do with Nimrod, because Nimrod was associated in the ancient world to a solar cult. So if we think about it, if Nimrod is the constellation Orion, and Orion is a mighty hunter before the Lord, what is Orion in the sky sitting across from? The constellation Taurus. Taurus is a bull, is it not? And isn't the moon associated to lunar horns? In the ancient world, didn't the ancient people say, well, the moon and the crescent moon, it looks like the horns of a bull. And so what we're seeing here is Orion's belt is on the left-hand side where the sun is. On the right-hand side, what sits across from Orion's belt? Constellation Taurus. What did I tell you at the beginning of the lecture was inside the constellation Taurus? Pleiades, the 7 stars. Oh, the 7 stars by the moon. So now we have a face-off. We've got a face-off between the sun and the moon. In other words, Orion's belt and Taurus. And remember, in the Bible, in the book of Job, both these constellations are listed. Now you're starting to see the importance, the significance. Interestingly enough, though, we can see that this information, this knowledge, where did it come from? Well, they said the Watchers, the fallen angels. Was Lucifer not an angel? He sure was, or she sure was. He's an androgynous angel. If you take a look in the center, what do you see? Between the sun and the moon, or in other words, between male and female, what do we have? The eye of Lucifer. Oh, you thought this was the eye of God. You think the eye on the money represents God? Why would God represent money? Money is mammon. You can love God or you can love mammon. So you can see this eye that you've been seeing on pyramids, this eye that you've been seeing with the chakras, this eye that you've been seeing on temples all over the world, including the US money. What does it point back to? A fallen angel. No biggie. So what we're looking at here is the yin and yang. That's right, it entered Asia too. Remember, it came through the Indus Valley. Indus Valley, India. That's where India gets its name. Indus Valley, it gets its name from Indra. Indra was the god Jupiter. Just so you know, there is a connection to Nimrod and Jupiter. In Babylon, they called this god Marduk. So yin and yang, sun and moon, that's what we're looking at in Asia. In other words, the same knowledge that came from Babylon, which before that came before the flood, came from the fallen angels. And I just showed you, I just wrote it all out and showed you all the steps. The Watchers brought mankind the omens of the sun, moon, and stars and all the signs of heaven. This is not my opinion. This is what the Masons wrote down. So if you want to disagree with this, really you're disagreeing with people that clearly have a much longer history than you do. And they've also preserved their history going all the way back before the flood. They founded your nations. You have Nimrod who built the Tower of Babel. You have Cain who built the first city. They're aligning themselves to that whole history. So if you want to argue with it, you're being kind of silly. Deuteronomy 4:1-3. Hear now, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances I am teaching you to follow, so that you may live and enter and take possession of the land that your Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you. So, okay, they're going into the promised land. Remember, they were in the wilderness in Exodus. Now they're coming into the promised land. None of the adults, though. Why? The generation of adults were all killed. Why? They were too stubborn. So it was the children that came into the land of Canaan. It says, you must not add or subtract from what I command you, so that you may keep the commandments of your Lord, your God, that I am giving you. So the children, this generation's being told, before you go in here, listen. Don't be like your parents. Listen. Do everything that I command you. Here's where it comes in. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did at Baal Peor. For the Lord your God destroyed from among you all who followed Baal of Peor. The parents were following Baal of Peor. The parents were involved in sun worship. We can see this because they had a golden calf. Gold has always been the alchemical metal that's been associated to the sun. So what were the parents following? Well, if they were in Egypt and they were influenced by the Egyptians, where were they living? Well, they lived in Ramses. Ramses, Ra, Ra. You can hear the sun god Ra right in the name of the place. They were living in a place where they were worshiping Ra. Ra is Baal. Baal was a sun god. Baal just means Lord. You could call him Lord Ra. You could call him Lord Marduk in Babylon, or perhaps Lord Nimrod. But you who held fast to the Lord your God are alive to this day, every one of you. So the children weren't disobedient like their parents. So the children were the ones who are alive to this day, whereas the parents died during the 40 years in the wilderness. They were so used to the old ways in Egypt, they could not handle the change. Now here's where it gets interesting. Same chapter, check this out. So we know we're talking about following exactly what the Lord says. This is subtitled A Warning Against Idolatry. So since you saw no form of any kind on the day the Lord spoke to you out of the fire of Horeb. What are we talking about here? That's Exodus 3:14. When Moses was talking to the burning bush, we know that was on Mount Sinai, which was in the region called Horeb. So it says that God never actually showed you his form. All you saw was fire in a bush. You don't know what God looks like. You don't know if he has angel wings. There was no form. So he reaffirms this here. Since you have saw no form of any kind on that day the Lord spoke to you out of the fire at Horeb, be careful that you do not act corruptly and make an idol for yourselves of any form or shape, whether in the likeness of a male or a female. So God says, don't make an image of me. You didn't see an image of me when Moses spoke to me, so don't make an image of me. Of any beast that is on the earth, or any bird that flies in the air, or any creature that crawls on the ground, or fish that is in the waters below. In other words, don't use human, male or female, or animals to depict me. Don't depict me in any way, shape, or form. This was strictly being told to the children. And you can see here in Egypt, remember, they're leaving from Egypt. Didn't they have a crocodile god? There was a place in Egypt called Crocodipolis, believe it or not. They had falcon gods. They had mixes of male and female amalgamated with both man and beast. So you can see this is speaking directly to what they just left. 19 goes on and says, when you look to the heavens and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all the host of heaven, do not be enticed to bow down and worship what the Lord your God has appointed to all the nations under heaven. So we know they just came from Egypt. In Egypt, didn't they have a solar god? The solar god was who? Ra. He also went by Horus. He also went by Osiris, right? We're talking about father or son here. So don't do anything with the sun. But he also says, don't do anything with the moon. Isis, wasn't Isis a lunar goddess? I mean, she had the crescent moon on her head. Yeah, I don't have anything to do with that. Or the host of heaven. So the sun, the moon, or any of the stars in the sky don't have anything to do with them. And let me tell you something interesting about the Pleiades. I don't know if you know this, but after the flood, people in the ancient world that did not know God, they thought the Pleiades caused the flood. They thought that the Pleiades actually, I think it's in the Apocrypha, they translate it as the terrible star or the horrible stars. Since at the time that the flood happened, the Pleiades were in a very specific spot in the sky, the people actually thought that the Pleiades were the ones that caused all this disaster. So people actually started to do sacrifices to the constellation Pleiades to try to appease the Pleiades, so that way the stars wouldn't wipe them all out again. They still hadn't figured out who God is. Yet the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace out of Egypt. Iron furnace, when the Bible gives you details, those details matter. What's the alchemical metal of iron associated to? Mars. Out of Egypt to be the people of his inheritance as you are today. So we can see that there was the worship of Ra, a sun god, but there must have been some kind of a war god, an iron furnace. Didn't the Pharaoh chase after them and try to kill them? Maybe he was under the influence of a war god. Remember, when we talk about spirits in the Bible, Spirits aren't like, little devils that run around that have red horns and stuff. Spirits work through you. They work through your nervous system. Any of us can be influenced by spirits. Your mom, your dad, your son, your daughter, they can all be influenced by spirits. When people say things like, I'm under the Christmas spirit, I'm in a good mood, it's this feeling that you get. Spirits work through feelings. When the Pharaoh was pissed off, what did the Pharaoh do? He chased after all the people. We found in other books like Jubilees, what was the spirit that was behind the anger of the Pharaoh? You would think that after all these plagues and then the killing of the children, you'd have enough. But what got them all riled up again? A spirit called Mastema, which we know as Baal, which we know is a solar deity. Hence why it's called an iron furnace. A furnace is a place where fire is. So it was the iron furnace because the god associated to the alchemical metal Mars, the war god, he was in the mind of the Pharaoh, got him ticked off, and chased those people out of Egypt before being washed away by the water. So the Iowa Lodge of Freemasonry on their website stated that Masonry traveled from Egypt into Europe and then England. Again, let's look at it. These two pillars, not Solomon's, were the earliest pillars in the legendary history of the craft, and our story then goes on to recount how the world was saved in Noah's flood and how the science of Masonry traveled from the east through Egypt into Europe and was finally established in England. So do you see it? Can you see how it happened? Do you think it's a lie? They still have the obelisk at their burial sites. The same obelisk you see at Heliopolis. What's Heliopolis? In the Bible, in Exodus, this place was called the city of On. It means pillar city. You ever hear in Egypt, or actually, you know what? It traveled farther east. You ever hear when the Asians go on when they meditate? Yeah, that came from the city of On. It traveled farther towards the east. They actually enchant. They divinate. They enchant the God's name by humming the word on when they meditate. And this pillar came from there. And this pillar showed up where? In London. It shows up where else? In Rome. It shows up at Washington Monument. It's a recreation of these same pillars. This pillar, just so you know, represents the phallus, the penis of their god, because they looked at the earth as being male and the sky as being female. The earth to the Egyptians in their early history was called Geb. And then in the and then what went above Geb was the female. The sky was called Nut. And so Nut would be on top of Geb. Later, it got flipped upside down. In other words, it became Mother Earth, which was Gaia, and then we got Zeus, the sky god. So things just got rotated. But originally, this phallus, this was the phallus of a male who laid on the ground. Now, what does it become? The phallus of a female. We've actually looked at her. She's called the Whore of Babylon. She's called Diana Lucifera, the chick with a dick. This is Duncan's Masonic Ritual and Monitor, or Guide to the 3 Symbolic Degrees of Ancient York Rite. So here we can see this is when you're getting from the Royal Arch the name of God. So we can tell you have the Bible, you connect to Cain. What is the name of God that you follow? Remember, the Lord cursed Cain. Cain was cursed and he was out to wander. Do you think that Cain kept the God of the Bible as his God? Probably not. Considering we saw that the knowledge that was written down on those two pillars were the knowledge of the Watchers. So then likely an angel or perhaps series of angels became the gods of Freemasonry. Ja-ba-lun. That's the name. It's broken into 3 parts, like a trinity. That's why there's no trinity in the Bible. They're merging the idea of their religion with the Bible to secretly get you to worship their God. This ineffable name in India was Aum, which in its triliteral form, that means 3-part name, was significant of the creative, preservative, and destroying power. That's funny because that's in Hinduism. And it goes on and says that is of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, which is Hinduism. Jehovah, of which varieties of the sacred name is used among the different nations of the earth. 3 particularly merit attention of the Royal Arch Masons. Jah, the name of the god which is found in the 68th Psalm. Baal or Bel. Bingo, there it is. So yes, you do worship Bel. You do worship Baal. That's Jupiter. That's Marduk. I could give you a whole bunch of names for him. This word signifies a lord master or possessor, and hence it was applied by many of the nations of the East to denote the Lord of all things and the master of the world. Okay, so the nations of the East, are they following the God of the Bible? Are Hindus following the God of the Bible? How could they be? They've got Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. That's incompatible. Well, here it tells you that Baal was the God of the East, who was the Lord of all things, master of the world. We should probably look at the verse 2 Corinthians 44, because there is a God of this world, except the God of this world in 2 Corinthians is Satan. So this is interesting. Now we start to have a better understanding who the God of this world is, or Satan, or Baal. What is the God of Freemasonry? It's very simple. If you're not worshiping the God of the Bible, if you're following angels that rebelled, and Cain was aligned with those angels, or at least his sons were, how could you possibly pretend that people aren't worshiping the adversary today? It's simple. You follow God or you follow Satan. There's no in between. On. This was the name by which Jehovah was worshipped among the Egyptians. Jehovah? Jehovah's supposed to be Christ. Christ was not worshipped by the Egyptians. This must be some kind of a false Christ. Did Christ ever tell us that there'd be false Christs? Book of Matthew. I've made these remarks on the three names of God in Chaldaic, Syriac, Egyptian. So all these countries that were just listed here in the Masonic Monitor, these are all countries that worship Baal. These are all countries that did not worship the God of the Bible. How funny that is. In the expectation that my Royal Arts companions will readily recognize them in a corrupted form. So wait a minute, if you're telling me this is the Royal Arch, I gotta stick around in Masonry until what, the 17th degree, I believe? It's either 17th or 18th. So how long would it take me to get up to the 17th or 18th degree? Chances are I've been invested in Freemasonry for years before I actually figure out who the God is. I bet when you start Freemasonry, you don't even know it's a religion, let alone that the God of Freemasonry, according to what they've written here, is Satan. That's hilarious. Does that mean good or bad? It doesn't really mean anything yet. As a matter of fact, when we find in the Bible, how is Satan described? Satan is described as an angel of light. Well, that doesn't sound bad. No, that's how you pull people away from people. Or that's how you pull people away from God. So the Masons worship Baal. You just read it. It's undeniable. And they learned it from the angels. When did they learn it from? Well, we can see from looking at the book of Jubilees, which was found in the 1940s, and we compare that to the story coming from Jubal and Jabal in the book of Genesis, and then we look at the Masons on their websites and what they've recorded in their oldest manuscripts. They got knowledge from the angels that fell. That's the line that no one wants to read in the churches. They recorded it on two pillars. It was found after the flood and then somehow traveled from Egypt and then into Europe and then to England, where obviously the knowledge is still preserved today. You can see a huge connection between Freemasonry and Cain's descendants. Cain built the first city on earth, named it after his son Enoch, which probably is the place called Uruk. The password to the Masonic Lodge is Tubal Cain. Why? Because he built the pillars. If we didn't have those pillars, we wouldn't have any of this knowledge today. The Cook manuscript records that Jubal, as the founder of art of music. So music, he must have obviously spoken to one of the angels that was quite musically talented. Jubal became very musically talented. The Cook manuscript records that Jabal as the shepherd of tending flocks. The reason why I highlighted that is because we see in the book of Zechariah, and I know that there's another family on this Sabbath meeting, they might have a very close connection to this. In the Bible, in the book of Zechariah, it talks about a false shepherd. Do you think maybe the false shepherd might have something to do with the new shepherd after Abel, the one that was coming through Cain, that maybe got his knowledge from fallen angels? The Cook manuscript records Jabal as the inventor of geometry. You have to wonder, how did they build these crazy temples you see all over the world? Today, people can't answer. How do we build the pyramids? How do we build the pyramids in China? How do we build the pyramids in Egypt? How do we build the pyramids in North America, Mexico, right? We also have them in North America. No one even talks about the pyramids in North America. It's like it's a big mystery why they hide that there's actual pyramids in Idaho or in Ohio. So we have pyramids all over the world. We can see that people were worshiping the sun, the moon, and the stars in different nations in the world. And then we can see that this sun, moon, and star worship actually was preserved through these pillars that lasted after the flood, recorded by Tubal. And then we see that Jabal was the one that knew a lot about geometry. So I assume that whatever Jabal knew about geometry must have been recorded somehow on these pillars. And my bet would be it's the pillar that's made of clay and brick, because the marble pillar would have sunk. Then we have the biblical flood. The Cook manuscript records Nimrod as the first Masonic Grand Master. That's a little bit interesting. So if I was to go into the churches and say, what do you think of Nimrod? Oh, Nimrod, doesn't that mean stupid or something because Nimrod's an idiot? Yeah, but here's the problem. The guy that tried to challenge God is connected to the people that founded Canada, right? John A. Macdonald founded the founding fathers. They found the United States. Kind of a big deal. Looks like this wasn't the first nation they founded. Maybe not the founding fathers like George Washington himself, but that knowledge that passed on through the history went all the way back to the man who built the first city, which was Cain. There's interesting things about Cain, though. Cain didn't have necessarily the best of qualities. Cain had two problems. For one, he murdered his brother, so he's a murderer. What else do we know about Cain? Cain was also a liar. He killed his brother and then lied about it. So if I'm looking at the Freemasons, okay, you guys, like, sure, you have lots of arts and crafts and stuff that's really impressive, but the person that all of your knowledge is coming through, according to the Bible, is someone who both killed and lied. So why is it that we didn't learn about the founding fathers in school and learn that they were Freemasons? Well, maybe people who knew their Bible a lot better, they might have said, that's not good because the founding fathers, if they're connected to Freemasonry, they have a history that goes back to Nimrod. And maybe if they did their due diligence, went back even farther, they'd see that, well, that goes back to Cain. That doesn't sit very well with church folk. And then Canada, well, John A. Macdonald, same problem. Nimrod built the Tower of Babel of bricks with the help of the nations of the world. Masons are bricklayers. So who built the cathedrals in Europe? Masons. Do you think you could build a cathedral like that? Do you know anyone who's a bricklayer that could build a cathedral like that? They must have known some pretty fancy tricks about bricklaying to build some of these cathedrals. Look at Notre Dame Cathedral as just an example. Those arches and buttresses are amazing in regards to the quality of the craftsmanship. I wonder if they learned that themselves or if they had help from someone else. The Masons call themselves the Builders. Here's a book called The Builders. When you become a Master Mason, they give you this book. It says The Builders, a story and study of Freemasonry. The ablest and most inspiring one-volume work in the literature of the craft. Why is this important? Because Jesus also talked about builders. Matthew 21 and 43. Matthew 21 and 43 reads, the stone the builders rejected. Jesus said to them, have you ever read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This is from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So Christ here is talking about who? Himself. So Christ was rejected by his own people. And when he was talking to those people, what did he say? He's quoting from Isaiah, and he's talking about the builders. So who are the builders? Who do you think the builders are? The Freemasons are the builders who rejected the cornerstone. Are Freemasons Christ-centered? How could you be Christ-centered when you are giving the name of Baal in the 17th or 18th degree? Whenever you're getting your Royal Arch degree, that's when you learn the name of God. And the name of God is obviously the God of the Egyptians, Syrians, Babylonians. Well, that wasn't Christ. That wasn't the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was Baal. The Freemasons are practicing the continuation of the worship of the sun, moon, and stars that was learned from the Watchers, the angels of Genesis 6:4 before the flood. I don't necessarily know if it's the sun, the moon, and the stars. I can say for sure, though, from what we've seen, it's definitely the worship of the sun. But when I see those two pillars, the two pillars do denote the sun, the moon, and we see the 7 stars associated with the Pleiades where the moon was. Their knowledge was preserved through the flood on 2 pillars crafted by Tubal-Cain. My opinion? No, it's on their website. It's on the Grand Lodge of Iowa, and we can find it in their oldest text by M.S. Cook. So we talked about the builders, right? The builders were the Masons. But at the same time, the Masons weren't being talked about in the book of Matthew. So who were the builders that Jesus was speaking to in Matthew 21? Matthew 21, 45 to 46, the parable of the wicked tenants. Look, it calls them wicked tenants. That's who the builders were. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they knew that Jesus was speaking about them. So who were the individuals that were called the builders? They were the Pharisees. The Pharisees and chief priests, those were the builders. They weren't Masons, but obviously the ideology that the Pharisees had. Remember, they rejected Christ. They must have had another religion. If they don't accept the Messiah when the Messiah comes, that means they must have a different idea. So we can see that the builders, they go all the way back to who? Cain. And what do we know about Cain? Cain was a murderer and he was a liar. Okay, so I guess that's what we can look at when we see the two pillars. One side can lie to you, the one side is destructive, they're killers. So when the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, whose parables? Christ's, they knew that Jesus was speaking about them. Although they wanted to arrest him, they were afraid of the crowds because the people regarded him as a prophet. So we found out later this group led to his crucifixion. On what charge? Was it a good charge? No, it was false charges. So what were the Pharisees doing? They took him into the Sanhedrin. What's the Sanhedrin? It's the courts. Didn't we see that Nimrod, who is Orion, also has a connection to the courts? The judge, right? The guy that holds the hammer. You understand why they're wicked tenants now? The Pharisees lied. The Pharisees pretended like he did something wrong. Christ was crucified over literally nothing. He said, if you say so. That was his remark. If you say so. So who are the Pharisees? You can see them today in Israel. Today we have the Israel Supreme Court. They have a lot of influence outside of Israel, but we studied and we already saw. On top of the Israel Supreme Court, what do we have? Well, the all-seeing eye, the pyramid with the eye in it. The pyramid, that's right, it came from Egypt. And if we take a look at this image in the center, this image came from Iran. Is there a connection between Iran and Egypt? Yes. The religion that was in Babylon also made its way into Egypt and India. So notice here, the index finger is raised. Now you're thinking, oh, this guy's just pointing up. It's all about context. If you start to watch this and actually understand what's going on the world stage, and you're not so naive, you'll see when people are passing symbols back and forth. So here we notice, in this picture in the center, do you see two pillars? I see two pillars. So we had a pillar that went all the way back to where? Solomon's temple. But before that, it went to before the flood. So obviously, if this is a religion, and it differs from what's in the Bible, it must be the religion that was given from who? The Watchers, the angels, Genesis 6:4. We know that the information recorded on the two pillars, like the two pillars we see in the picture, it came from fallen angels. They taught a different religion. Don't you think that if angels were angry at God and they want to pull people away from God, they'd come up with their own idea and their own deity? Of course they would. And so here we can see the Jews in Israel today, we call this Judaism. What is Judaism? If it's not the Bible, then what is it? We can see even when we look at the things like the menorah or the Hanukkah, there's 8 candles, sometimes 9 candles, but in the Torah, it said there should be 7 candles. Which Jews are you guys? Because you're not even following your own religious books. I understand if you say the New Testament, we reject Christ, but why aren't you following at least the Torah? That means you must be following paganism and masquerading it as if it's something else. So this is a solar religion. You can see the suns I placed on the head. Why do they wear hats like this? Because a long time ago, people used to worship a god called Saturn. And Saturn used to be thought of as a sun. And we all know the really remarkable thing about Saturn, what stands out is the ring. And so they wear these top hats that have the big ring around it. Sometimes in Freemasonry, you'll see cowboy hats. And cowboy hats also have a big ring around them. You'll also notice on the top of these 2 pillars, there's 2 bulls. And 2 bulls, that's like cattle. In Egypt, you also had bulls. It was called Apis the bull. In the religion of Mithra, which was a sun worship religion, and Mithraism came from Iran and was directly connected to this religious image you see in the center. They also had a god that slayed a bull. So you're going to find there's some very interesting connections between Masonry and what we call Judaism today, operating out of Israel. Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees when he talked about the builders who rejected the chief cornerstone. They did not accept Christ. They're waiting for another Messiah. Israel is worshiping Baal today. Baal is a sun god. That doesn't necessarily denote good or bad. We haven't got to that part yet. But we do know that they rejected the God of the Bible. They still continue to this day. That's why in Israel, as of the 1980s, the Supreme Court, which has a symbol from Egypt on top of the building, it said if you're a Messianic Jew, if you're a Jew for Jesus, you cannot come back. But if you're a Kabbalist, or if you're someone that only believes in the Torah and the Old Testament, you are welcome. So these are Jews that rejected Christ. These are the builders, the Pharisees. Sun worship goes all the way back to Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as before the flood. So the knowledge was passed down from the angels, the watchers, but we can see it both before the flood and after the flood. I'll show you that it was practiced in Sodom and Gomorrah. And we know the word Sodom comes from the word sodomy. Does that mean that some people who practice sun worship are sodomites? Yes. Does that mean that they're necessarily the leadership in Israel? Some of them. Deuteronomy 32, 28 to 32. For their rock is not like our rock. Who's the rock of the church? Christ. That's right, the one that the builders rejected. So in Sodom and Gomorrah, we see, for their rock is not like our rock, even our enemies concede. But their vine is from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Okay, so we've got two rocks and two vines. So that means Sodom and Gomorrah has a false Christ. It's being compared to the same language that we use as a Christian to follow Christ. If the rock is Christ and the vine is Christ, well, Sodom and Gomorrah has a counterfeit. And we know in the book of Matthew, Christ said, when the apostles asked him, or the disciples asked him, how will we know it's the sign of your coming, Jesus? And what did he say immediately after that? Be careful that no one deceives you. What? I don't get it. Why would you be coming back and then we ask you and you say, be careful no one deceives you? Because you will know when I am coming back, when people are trying to pretend to be me. When they try to take the Bible and symbolically misrepresent it so you go in a different direction, you'll know I'm coming soon. So we have a counterfeit rock and a counterfeit vine, and we know it came from Sodom and Gomorrah. Who lived in Sodom and Gomorrah? We know that Lot did. Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham, he lived in Sodom, and his sons continued in the worship of the sun and moon. Really? Where do we get that in the Bible? I'll show you. Lot had two children. And it was interesting how he had these two children. If you remember, Abraham had a talk with God. It was in Genesis 18, I believe. It was at the Oaks of Mamre. And when he was speaking to the Lord, he said, so your angels are going down to fulfill your order and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because it's so wicked. But my nephew Lot lives in Sodom and Gomorrah. If there is someone who is righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, can the town be spared? And so, of course, there was negotiation between the Lord and Abraham. And eventually it gets to the point where Abraham realizes by the 10 commandments, there is not one person living in Sodom and Gomorrah that should be spared. So he just pleaded with God and said, can you just spare Lot? He's my nephew. And so that's what the Lord agreed to do. But with Lot continued this same religion that we saw in Sodom and Gomorrah through his sons. And I'll show you. Genesis 19, 34 to 38. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, look, I slept with my father last night. Let us get him drunk with wine again tonight so you can go and sleep with him and we can preserve our father's line. If you remember in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the wife was told, so the whole family was told, don't look back. Once you leave the city, don't look back. What did the wife of Lot do? She didn't listen. She looked back. What happened? She turned into a pillar of salt. So how does Lot continue a bloodline when all he has is daughters? He has no sons. So the daughters think, oh, let's get him drunk. We'll have sex with him. We'll have sons, and then we'll continue Lot's bloodline. Wow, this clearly didn't come from the Lord. So again, that night they got their father drunk with wine. And the younger daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware when she lay down or when she got up. Thus, both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter gave birth to a son and named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. Okay, so later in the Bible, we read about the Moabites. Remember this name. The Moabites came from Lot's first son, from the older daughter, from Moab. The younger daughter also gave birth to a son. She named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites today. Well, did the Ammonites and Moabites follow the God of Israel? Absolutely not. If you read the rest of the Bible, especially Kings, you'll see that. 1 Kings 11:7. At that time on a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Shamash, the abomination of Moab, and for Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites. So here are the two children. These were the two children he saw birthed by Lot when he had sex with his daughters when he was drunk. And then one is worshiping a god called Shamash. The other one is worshiping a god called Moloch. And Solomon later in the book of Kings, he's worshiping them too. If we take a look at the word Shamash, also known as Shamash, in Babylon, or Samaria, it was called Utu. It's the exact same thing. Or it's funny, there's a show called Babar with an elephant. Check a look at one of the alternate names, Babar. Shamash is Shamash. It's just linguistics. Here we can see he appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Wait a minute. Are you telling me that the god of Gilgamesh was Shamash? That's really interesting because, of course, we've identified Gilgamesh as who? Nimrod. Well, was it Nimrod worshiping Baal? Yeah. So who's Shamash? Baal. And then look, lineage. Son of the moon god Sin. So we've got a sun god and a moon god. We can get them both from Shamash. So Shamash must be the sun. So I guess by default, if we're looking at the other child, it's probably the moon then. But let's see. Utu, the sun god. Utu was also known as Shamash. Okay, so one of the children that Lot had was called Moab. The other one was called Ben-Ami. This is where these two gods came from. One of them was called Shamash. It's a solar deity. That's interesting because before the flood, we saw that they wrote on these pillars, and on the pillars, they recorded this knowledge from the angels that had to do with the worship of the sun, the moon, and the host of heaven. Look at 1 Kings 11:7. Shamash, the abomination of Moab. Well, it's common sense. If we know that the angels gave them this lunar solar worship, if Shamash we've identified as the sun, then Moloch must be the moon. And if you know what Moloch looks like, Moloch has horns. And when you're dealing with horns, horns deal with a lunar deity. So the Ammonites worshipped a lunar deity called Moloch, which means when we look at Moab, Moab was worshiping Shamash, which is the sun. They would also denote male and female, but we'll look at that later. So now we look back at Freemasonry. Okay, on the right-hand side, we see Moloch, that's the moon. On the left-hand side, we see Shamash. So we have the pillar of the sun and the pillar of the moon. Is Freemasonry connected to Judaism? Because remember, all the stuff they read about in Kings and all the stuff they read about in the Gospels, these aren't Masons we're talking about. These are Jews that we're talking about. So are the Jews and Masons somehow affiliated? Because they look like they have the same ideology. So what we call Judaism today is what the Gentiles call Freemasonry. If we look, we can see in Israel, we've got this pyramid with an eye. Okay, it looks like the Masonic Egyptian presence made its way to Israel. But the question is, did the Freemasons give it to Israel, or did Israel give it to the Freemasons? Which came first? We've got a statue, or we've got one pillar that says B. B stands for Boaz. The other pillar stands for J, which is Jachin. Why is that? Well, because the pillars at Solomon's temple, remember, they said that the pillars had to do with Solomon's temple, but they said, no, actually, it was before Solomon. So what they're doing is for Gentiles that don't know the Bible, right? A lot of Europeans, they thought that Freemasonry was just a men's club. They didn't see it as a religion. They didn't join because they had any bad intentions, and they surely didn't join thinking they were worshiping Satan. So then when they looked at this, they said, oh, these pillars just represent Solomon's temple. Solomon was a king in the Bible, and that was probably the end of their investigation. They didn't know that this went back before Solomon because they said that these pillars are actually going back to the bloodline of Cain. What does Solomon have to do with Cain? Well, absolutely nothing. So then what do these pillars actually have to do with the pillars of Solomon's temple? Absolutely nothing. All you did was overlap something that was pagan, make it sound Christian, and a whole bunch of Europeans who decided to join this men's club, they were okay with it. Because they sure wouldn't join a club probably in the 1950s and 60s that thought it had anything to do with the worship of Satan. The Pharisees hid the secret of the sun and moon worship behind the pillars of Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple had nothing to do with the worship of the sun and moon. You can say by the book of Kings, chapter 11, Solomon started to go sideways. But when this temple was built, God had no connection to these pillars of marble and pillars of clay and brick that was talking about what happened before the Old Testament and Jubilees. They just overlapped it later. Here's the Jewish news of Northern California. Jews and Freemasons, a not-so-secret brotherhood. Actually, Jews and Freemasonry share a long history together, including in the Bay Area, which is home to 10 lodges and 3 Mason-owned headquarters in San Francisco alone. There are 60 lodges in California. Wow, a lot of influence in one state. According to Fred Rosenbaum, co-founder of Lyris Judaica and a scholar on the subject, many middle-class San Francisco Jews of late 19th century were Masons. Because the Bay Area is one of the country's least anti-Semitic regions, Jews were successful early on in business, politics, and on the social scene. Masonic lodges were open to Jewish members, with leading local rabbis and synagogue leaders among those taking the pledge. So I guess Masonry must have been compatible with what the rabbis were teaching. Otherwise, wouldn't that be some kind of a sin? We know that the Jews follow the Torah. We know the Jews try, or at least they say they try to keep the 615 or 603 commandments. Well, you can't have another God. So if this is a religion, that would be incompatible with Judaism, would it not? I mean, they still follow the Torah, so they say. So then Masonry must somehow synergize with Judaism if the rabbis were okay with it. As it turns out, Greenwald and Chalmer are not unique. Many Jews over the years have joined Freemasonry, an ecumenical organization open to men of all faiths. For those of you who don't know what ecumenical means universal. So in other words, Freemasonry is a universal religion. Can Jews read the Torah and say that the worship of the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is some kind of a universal faith? Not at all. It's very unique. It's very distinct. Jacob, which is Israel, was unique to the Lord, where the other nations, they were all connected to Babylon. So is Masonry actually the faith that came out of Babylon? Is Judaism really the faith that came out of Babylon? Well, you guys said that your founder was Nimrod. Scottish Rite is one of the several international Masonic orders. Greenwald, a Millbrae resident, knows many Masons who are Jewish and Christian and Muslim. And the ranks of Freemasonry have included statesmen from Ben Franklin to Jesse Helms, musicians from composer Gene Silbus to cowboy Gene Autry. Presidents Fillmore, Jackson, Taylor, Hoover, and both Roosevelts were Masons. Okay, so let me get this straight here. Jews, Christians, Muslims, it is a universal religion because Islam is completely at odds with Christians because they don't believe in Christ. Muslims believe in Allah. How can these guys all come together under one web like this? Because it's the religion of Babylon. It's the universal religion. Famous Jewish Masons include Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, David Sarnoff, Ernest Borgnine, Eddie Cantor, and Harry Houdini. That's right, Harry Houdini, a magician. Weren't there magicians in Egypt? There sure were. In the book of Exodus, when we had Moses performing the miracles on behalf of God, the Egyptians had magicians as well. And if you've studied with us on Wednesdays, you know that there were so many miracles the magicians were able to perform, but then eventually they said, uh-oh, this is from the finger of God. Once it came to the fourth plague, all of a sudden the magicians couldn't keep up anymore, the plague of gnats. Freemasonry and Judaism, the secret powers behind revolution. What? Freemasonry is a Jewish establishment whose history, grades, official appointments, passwords, and explanations are Jewish from beginning to end. If you're wondering where this quote came from, I believe this was the New York Times in the early 1900s. This is Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. So clearly, it wasn't Freemasonry that inspired Judaism. It was Judaism that inspired Freemasonry. So the connection to Nimrod and the Freemasons is really coming from Judaism. But is that surprising? When the Pharisees approached Christ, what did he say? He called them the builders. And aren't the Freemasons the builders? See how it connects together now? Freemasonry was inspired by Judaism, not the other way around. It's the Pharisees. Is Masonry some kind of universal religion? Because it sure sounds like it. If Islam and Christians, if everyone can come in, I'm sure Buddhists could come in too. What about Hindus? The religion of Freemasonry. This is Truth Magazine. This is another Masonic publication. Let's see what they have to say. Dr. Albert Mackey. This is a 33rd degree Freemason, so we know he's credible. No disbeliever in the existence of a God can be made a Freemason. In other words, you can't be a Freemason without at least believing in God. I wonder why that's important, because if Muslims and Jews and Christians, if we can all join, why does it matter? That means you must have a God then. Why would you care? One does not need to believe in Jehovah, just believe in a God. Whoa, back up for a second. Who's Jehovah? That's the Lord in the Old Testament. Isn't Christ the Lord? Yeah. So then you don't have to believe in Christ to be a Freemason. Well, then you've really lowered it down then. We've already noticed that you either follow Christ or you follow who? Satan. There's no way around it. You cannot get around it. The reason for this is Masonry is a universal religion, taking into its membership even those who believe in pagan gods. Well, why would it matter, right? If you had these two pillars and the two pillars came from the angels, and the angels were what the pagan gods were. I mean, Shamash and Moloch, these were the pagan gods. Well, these were associated to the sun and moon. Masonry, as I understand it, lays claim to embrace all truth, as it borrowed and preserved truths from all the religions and philosophies of the past. Okay, so you blended together everything on the earth that was called religion, with the exception of the Bible, really. You just twisted it, but you blended it all together. Why? How could you do that? Because Masons and Jews understood that there was Babylon, and all the other religions came from Babylon. Whether you call yourself a Buddhist, whether you call yourself a Hindu, whether you believe in the Norse gods or African gods, they all came from where? Iran. Iran was scattered in Genesis 11. Dr. Mackey says, if Freemasonry were simply a Christian institution, well, I guess it's not a Christian institution. There's an if there. The Jew and the Muslim and the Brahm, well, the Brahm that's a Hindu, and the Buddhist could not consciously take part or partake in its illumination, but its universality is its boast. So in other words, all religions, all faiths can come towards Masonry because it is the religion of Babylon. Babylon were the people that tried to fight against God. So regardless of what religion on the earth you pick, hey, just don't pick the Bible, just don't pick Jesus, and you're part of this rebellion. Albert Pike says, it is the universal, eternal, immutable religion, such as God planted it in the heart of universal humanity. Pike further says, Masonry, around whose altars the Christian, the Hebrew, the Muslim, the Brahmin, the followers of Confucius and Zoroaster, yeah, that's the guy with his finger that's stuck up, can assemble as brethren and unite in prayer to the one God who is above all the Baalim. Read that again. To the one God is above all the Baalim. The Baalim, that's the priests of Baal. So what you're saying is all these faiths, with the exception of the Bible, they're all pointing back to who? The sun god, Baal, the Lord of all things, Satan. Must needs leave it to each of the initiates to look for the foundation of his faith and hope to the written scriptures of his own religion. In other words, if you follow any of these religions minus the Bible, they're all going to lead you back to Babylon. So go, become a Muslim, become a Brahmin. It doesn't matter. You're all going to end up in the same place. Just keep studying. Pike again says, Masonry also has her mission to perform, with her traditions reaching back to the earliest times. Earliest times, I'd say, that's Cain. And her symbols dating further back than even the monumental history of Egypt extends. Yeah, we saw that. It's before the flood. She invites all men of all religions to enlist under her banners and to war against evil, ignorance, and wrong. But Jason, you said this was the worship of Satan. I didn't say Satan was evil. I just said that they're worshiping the adversary. Satan, according to the Bible, masquerades as an angel of light. And these Masons are not doing any wrong. They're learning morals. The only problem that I have is when you take 7 commandments instead of 10 commandments that were handed down to Moses, you start worshiping angels, Satan, the one that masquerades as God, instead of worshiping God himself. That's my point of contention. I don't think Masons are evil. Not all of them. Some of them are. But I think most of them are really good people. They're just not worshiping God. Again, quoting Pike, he says, Masonry propagates no creed except its own simple and sublime one, that universal religion taught by nature and reason. It's a nature religion. Wouldn't that be the worship of the sun, the moon, the stars? Because nature religion is attached to the moon, and the moon is associated to the earth, which is nature. Its lodges are neither Jewish, Muslim, nor Christian temples. It reiterates the precepts of morality of all religions. It venerates the character and commends the teachings of the great and good of all ages and of all countries. It extracts the good and not the evil, the truth and not the error from all creeds. It acknowledges that there is much which is good and true in all. So what it's doing is it takes out the bad from religion, it keeps the good. I'm like, well, that sounds like a good idea. But the problem is this. If you just grab from the Quran and grab from the Bible and grab from the Bhagavad Gita and what other book you want to write, maybe the writings of Confucius, you just grab from those texts and pull out the things that you like. You're not necessarily following the truth. You're just building your own faith. Since Masonry embraces the religions of the world, it cannot require belief in Jehovah, for this would exclude the most of the world. Of course, most of the world doesn't believe in Jesus. It's 2021. In order to accept Masons who believe in pagans, they require a belief in God or a supreme being. Yeah, last time I checked, Jabulon has nothing to do with Christ. That's a totally different God. That's a Trinity God. So Jehovah is the Lord, which is Christ. The Freemasons are the builder who rejected the chief cornerstone, as Christ pointed out in Matthew. Not the Freemasons per se, but the Pharisees. And the Pharisees went on to create what we call Freemasonry today. Freemasonry is Judaism, the worship of the sun and moon, for all men as a universal faith. Freemasonry records its founder as Nimrod from the Tower of Babel. Freemasonry is the continuation of the religion of Babylon, taught by the Watchers, the fallen angels, before the flood and preserved by Tubal-Cain on 2 pillars. The pillar of brick clay was found after the flood, recorded in the book of Jubilees 8. And this knowledge made its way to Babylon, Egypt, Europe, and eventually England. That's where the Grand Lodge of England is, 1717, check the date. Christ referred to the Pharisees who practiced this as wicked tenants. Okay, so some of these bricklayers, some of these masons, some of the worshipers of Baal, they aren't good people. Some of them are. Of course, every man is obviously chosen. I mean, every man is either good or evil based on his decisions. Good or evil based on what he subjectively feels? No, what kind of judgment would that be? Do you write a test in university or college or high school even, and you just subjectively write whatever you want, and then based on how you felt you did, you get a pass? No, there's a grading key. Well, the grading key for judgment in the Bible is the 10 Commandments. If you aren't following them, you're failing. And so here we see when you remove 3 commandments, you don't know God anymore, which means you've rejected the chief cornerstone. So what are you failing at? You're failing at life. And chances are, if you start to fail like this, you might start to become a wicked tenant. This religion must exist all over the world because Babylon in Genesis 11 was scattered across the earth. Can we prove it? Of course we can. Is the worship of the sun and moon and the host of heaven found across the earth? That's really the question we need to ask. If we know that what Nimrod got came from Hermes, which is Mercury, which is Thoth of the Egyptians after the story of Atlantis, which was really the flood. If we know that this information actually came from Tubal-Cain, who wrote it down onto pillars, and then it later came in the hands of Nimrod after one of Noah's sons found it, could we somehow prove that the worship of the sun, the moon, and the host of heaven occurs across the earth? Yes, because remember, when we looked at one of the children, which was Jabal, Jabal was the one who knew geometry. And he was the one that was able to build in ways that still to this day perplex people. When we look at these different pyramids across the earth, you're going to notice the pyramids are associated to the sun, the moon, and the host of heaven. Here we're taking a look at Mexico. Look at this, and I'll try to pronounce it. San Juan Teotihuacan. It's the pyramid of the moon. Not looking good, guys. We've got pyramids all over the world, and the first one we're looking at is the Pyramid of the Moon. It's the second largest pyramid in modern day San Juan and Mexico, after the Pyramid of the Sun. So there's a Pyramid of the Sun and a Pyramid of the Moon in Mexico. That's a far ways away from Babylon. Iran is across the ocean. The temples of the sun and moon are located in the remote region of Capitol Reef National Park. They are accessible by a rough dirt road which begins outside the park. There is no fee to visit them. Where's this sun and moon pyramid? In Utah, in the United States? Okay, so north of Mexico, we've got pyramids of the sun and moon in the United States, and this isn't the only one. Let's go to China, the sun and moon temple. Guilin, China. Well, we know that the Aryans came in. They came in from Iran, because that's who the Aryans are. The Aryans came into the Indus Valley. They gave the god Indra to India, which is Jupiter, which is Baal. And then they continued on their way into Asia. Is that why we have temples of the sun and moon in China? And look, one is blue and one is red. Oh, I guess one is the sun and one is the moon. Go figure. Egypt had a sun god, Ra, Horus, Osiris. And it seemed like the pyramids were aligned to the constellation Orion. Check this out. Pyramids of Giza. There's 3 pyramids. Oh, that must be the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. No, that's the Babylon Trinity. That's the Trinity of the sun, the moon, and the host of heaven. You see, what you're looking at is one pyramid is for Osiris, One pyramid is for the child Horus, and the other pyramid is for Isis. As a matter of fact, we've looked at the temple of Baalbek, which is in Phoenicia. Baalbek obviously gets its name from Baal. What was the biggest temple? Well, the temple of Jupiter. Well, Jupiter was Baal. Was there any other temples? Two more. It's a trinity, right? So what else was at Baalbek? Well, there's a temple of Venus. Well, Venus is Aphrodite, which is Isis. And then we also had a temple that was for the child, Tammuz. So Tammuz is Horus. So what we're looking at, the Virgin Mary holding the child, they've been lying this whole time and showing you what? Isis holding Horus. It's the pagan trinity. They're teaching you the Trinity because the Trinity came from Babylon, and before that, before the flood, because the Trinity is really denoting the sun, the moon, the stars. 1, 2, 3. A Trinity. There is no Trinity in the Bible. Elohim, which is God, is more than three. You want proof? I'll give you proof. Psalms 82, 1-8. God presides in the divine assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. What? God among the gods? So what would this read in Hebrew? Elohim presides in the divine assembly. He renders judgment among the Elohim. So then there must be more than three, because who are these other Elohim that he's judging? What part of the Bible did you read where the Holy Spirit and Christ were being judged? I don't remember that part because Christ was the judge. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? When did Christ ever show partiality to the wicked? When did the Holy Spirit do it? Looks like we've got more than three Elohim. Salah. Defend the cause of the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the rights of the afflicted and oppressed. Rescue the weak and needy. Save them from the hand of the wicked. They do not know or understand. They wander in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I have said, this is the Lord speaking, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. But like mortals, you will die, and like rulers, you will fall. You cannot pretend that these verses in Psalms 82 are speaking to Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We know for sure that Christ is not going to die like a mortal. The Holy Spirit is not going to die like a mortal. There are other gods here. Who are these gods? Arise, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations are your inheritance. Weren't the nations the inheritance of something else after Genesis 11? Psalms 82 is directed to the angels who were appointed to rule the nations after Genesis 11. This was recorded in the Greek Septuagint in Deuteronomy 32. It's kind of hard to see in the Masoretic text, but in the Greek Septuagint, it's clear as day. The Lord kept Jacob, Israel, as his portion, but all the nations that rebelled in Babylon, they were given up to the angels, the sons of God that we just read about in Psalms 82. These are the other gods. These are the other Elohim. This is where the false pagan trinity is coming from, of the sun, the moon, and the host of heaven. Here, we can look at the translation to prove it. Psalms 82:1. All you need is this one verse. God takes his stand in his own congregations, his assembly. He judges in the midst of the rulers. Look at the word rulers. It says Elohim. Look at the first word, which is God. It says Elohim. It says what it says. God judges amongst the gods. If you're not aware that the angels were given a portion of all the nations after Babylon, you would think that Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the Trinity, you would think that that is all that there is. Elohim refers to all the heavenly beings. And remember, the watchers, where did they come from? I thought Satan fell from heaven. Ah, I see. So he was an Elohim as well. Looks like it's not a Trinity, guys and gals. China, Xi'an pyramids. Mexico, we just looked at this one. And then Egypt, the Great Pyramids. And what are they all aligned to? The constellation Orion. Wasn't Orion Nimrod? Isn't that the fable that he ascended to the stars? So then you're telling me that the religion that's seen in China, Egypt, Mexico, all these pyramids are pointing back to where? Must be the worship of the sun, the moon, and the stars. 1, 2, 3. Constellation Orion. That's what the pyramids are pointing to. And Orion is Nimrod. And Nimrod was who? A mighty hunter before the Lord. A giant. He was also known as a reaper. He had the sickle. He had the archer's bow. That's interesting because in the New Testament, it mentions that Satan fires fiery darts in the book of Ephesians. So you need to wear the whole armor of God. Wouldn't a fiery dart be like a sun dart? Ah, so Orion, the hunter that holds the archer's bow. You were talking about Orion. That's what that verse was talking about. He's also the reaper. When you see the angels come and they come with the sickles. That's also Orion. Look at this. We've got the Balinese, Mayan, and then another image of another Balinese temple, another Mayan temple. Why do they keep building everything in this 3 fashion? Well, what were they doing with the pyramids? What's up with the number 3? Is it the pagan trinity? It's not the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, unless, of course, you're talking about the sun, the moon, and the stars. So it'd be the sun father, it'd be the moon mother. I guess it'd be a star child. Maybe that's why the New Agers want to be star children. But this is seen all over the world. They call it the triptych temples. Richard Casario does an amazing piece on this. You can see I've used some of his images. Definitely, if you're interested in this topic, check out his books. He'll show you images of temples for days. I'm only showing you a couple. But you'll find out all these temples, they have the same structure. 3 doors, 3 doors, 3 doors, 3 doors. And a lot of them will have a statue with some kind of a entity with like a third eye in the middle of their head. So they opened up their mind's eye. How did they do it? We've studied that before. Drugs and meditation. Do these ancient cultures experiment with plants? Did these ancient cultures, some of them meditate? Absolutely. Starting to notice why all these temples look the same now? They gained the same knowledge from the host of heaven, from before the flood, after the flood. Look at this, but it's not just these ancient temples. Wouldn't this be a Catholic cathedral? Why is the Catholic cathedral designed in a very similar fashion? Who built it? Wasn't it the stonemasons in Europe? So the stonemasons said that their founder is Nimrod. If all these temples across the earth that are built like the number 3, with a sun temple, lunar temple, and then this middle place that has to do with the host of heaven, wouldn't that be all in alignment with what the Masons were teaching, being connected to Nimrod? This is all just a continuation of the Babylon religion. That means the whole world, from east to west, you can see remnants of this world universal religion. That's what the Masons said. It doesn't matter if you're a Buddhist, a Hindu, or whatever. I guess as long as you don't read the Bible literally, you'll never figure this out. Look at all these cathedrals. All these stonemasons built these cathedrals all the same. These 3 doors, 1, 2, 3. You come in the middle one, the middle pillar. Didn't Christ say, don't take the broad, don't take the broad, take the narrow path? The narrow path, they're emulating it with this middle. So you've got the sun and the moon, which must represent these 2 pillars on the outside, and then the inside, that must be their middle pillar. And then above it, notice I have these big they call them rose windows. This big circular window, it's supposed to be your heart chakra, because the heart was the key to all of it. And didn't we say that Lucifer was a love god? Lucifer, when you look at those 2 pillars that the Masons had, you had the sun on one side, the moon on the other. They overlapped it with Solomon's temple, kind of Jachin and Boaz. What do we see in the center? An eye, and the eye said Lucifer. So what was the third eye of these different cultures connected to? A fallen angel. And then what were they also connecting? Their heart chakra. They loved this fallen angel. I thought you're supposed to love the Lord God with all your heart and all your mind. Well, Lucifer wants the same thing. So when we compare these different temples and everywhere in the world, here's some more: Mexico, Egypt, Indonesia, India, and we see those 3 doors. That's just like the Freemasons. That's just like the Shriners. That's just like Skull and Bones, right? Skull and Bones, Yale University, it's set up the exact same way. Always the 3 doors. That means that they all know about this universal religion. That means that they all know it came from Babylon. How about the Flintstones? The Loyal Order of the Dinosaurs. Wasn't Lucifer a serpent? Look at the design. We got the 3 doors again. Wonder where they got the idea from. Would this be propaganda? You tell me. How about the Loyal Order of the Water Buffalo? Maybe this one is for the sun, the dinosaur, the serpent, because a lot of times they would associate the flying serpent, the dragon, to a dinosaur. So this must be the solar temple in the Flintstones. Obviously, the water buffalo has horns on his head. That's the lunar temple. And again, we got window, which must be the doors. And then we have the center door. So we've got the same thing. But they also did on The Simpsons. The Simpsons had an episode with the stone cutters. What's a stone cutter? Sure sounds like a mason to me. And if you look, you can see the 3 pyramids, the all-seeing eye. So we've got that triptych design that we see all over the world. This came from Babylon. And before Babylon, it came from where? Before the flood, on some pillars. So the Simpsons, let's look at the stonecutters.
I'd give anything to get into the Stonecutters.
What do they do there, Dad?
I'm a member. What do they do? What don't they do? Oh, they do so many things, they never stop. Oh, the things they do there. My stars.
You don't know what they do there, do you?
Not as such, no. I'm a stonecutter.
Dad, remember those self-hypnosis classes we took to help us ignore Grandpa?
Do I ever? It's 5 years later, and I still think I'm a chicken. I'm a chicken, Marge.
I know. Maybe we should be listening to him now.
I'm a member. Huh? What? Ha!
You're a member of the Stonecutters, Grandpa?
Oh, sure. Let's see. I'm an elk, a mason, a communist. I'm the president of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance for some reason. Ah, here it is. The Stonecutters. This is it. My ticket in. They have to let me join if I'm a son of a member. I'll take this communist one, too. Coming through. Can't throw me out. My father's a member. I'm in.
Okay, Homer, you're in. Just don't point that thing at me.
Oh, thanks, Lenny. When am I going to be initiated?
As soon as number one gets here.
Number one? What kind of stupid wiener name is that? Hello, my name is Number One. And so forth.
We call each other by number, not by name. Carlo's number 14, I'm number 12. Burnsy's number 29.
You outrank Mr. Burns here?
Sure, watch. Hey, 29, get out of here! Wah, wah.
Thank you, sir. May I have another? Patience, Monty. Climb the ladder.
Is he the leader?
Of this chapter, there are chapters all over the world, and it has been foretold that someday a chosen one will...
Okay. I didn't ask for your life story.
Let the initiation begin.
All stonecutters must take the leap of faith. If you survive this 5-story plunge, your character will be proven.
Happy landings!
I think I have to do it again. My blindfold came off.
This ritual is called crossing the desert.
Ow!
And this we call the unblinking eye.
Ow! Hey, have you ever noticed that the crossing the desert is a lot like the unblinking eye? It's exactly like the wreck of the Hesperus.
And now the final ordeal, the paddling of the swollen ass with paddles.
And by the sacred parchment, I swear that if I reveal the secrets of the stonecutters, may my stomach become bloated and my head be plucked of all but 3 hairs.
I think you should have to take a different oath.
Everyone takes the same oath. Welcome to the club number 908. You have joined the sacred order of the stonecutters, who since ancient times have split the rocks of ignorance that obscure the light of knowledge and truth. Now let's all get drunk and play ping pong.
Because he's already kind of heavy, you know.
Well, to be honest, I never got around to ordering that part for you, so, it's still gonna be a couple of weeks.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
But what if I were to shake your hand in this wise? Wah!
Wait! Well, I didn't realize you were a member.
So long, suckers!
Same old space, huh, Dad?
Yep, but they gave me these rollerblades so I can glide to the front door. Whoa. Sweet. Jealous?
Well, no, we've got the same chair.
You're jealous.
Your membership pack.
What's this?
We put that sticker on your car so you won't get any tickets. And this other one keeps paramedics from stealing your wallet while we're working on you.
Oh, and don't bother calling 911 anymore. Here's the real number.
Ooh.
So if you take a look, you can see what he was inside of the stonecutter lodge. We can see on the left-hand side, this all-seeing eye that we saw in Egypt. On the right-hand side, we can see the Masonic compass and square. You can't pretend this isn't Freemasonry. And then in the middle, what do you see? The sun and the moon. So what do you think this religion is actually about? This is the pillars from before the flood that are written on by Tubal Cain. And they put this in your face all the time. If you look at this, this is the image. You can see the compass and square here. Remember, you saw Homer doing a secret handshake? Well, there's a special handshake. And then if you look above it, you can see this eye. But the eye I thought was associated to Lucifer. And it looks like it's the sun. So is Lucifer the sun? Is Lucifer the light? Remember, God is the light. It says in the book of John, God is light. There is no darkness in him. Well, Lucifer is a mixture of dark and light. And if we look, that's in the very center of this logo. I'll also point out when Homer did his initiation, they took him up 5 stories and he fell 5 stories. How many points on a pentagram? 5. What's the pentagram associated to? Venus. What's Venus associated to in the book of Isaiah? Lucifer, the morning star. Okay. If you look around the world, you'll also see this. This symbol that you can see from east to west, where you can find pyramids and all-seeing eyes on statues. What you're seeing is on the left and the right, where you see either 2 animals or 2 serpents or 2 fish or 2 whatever. This represents the sun and the moon. It's just like in Zoroastrianism, when you saw those 2 bulls facing inward. As a matter of fact, the Zoroastrians with their 2 pillars and 2 bulls, that's where the Red Bull symbol came from. Next time you look at a can of Red Bull, it's 2 bulls facing each other with a sun in the center. That's exactly what you're looking at here. And it's all over the world. So we have 2 forces facing each other. In other words, the sun and the moon are facing each other. But notice that there's someone who stands in the middle. What does this represent? Once you learn how to balance the forces of the sun and moon, or electricity and magnetism, you become a god. So this is the symbolism of a god. The one who stands in between the 2 pillars denotes a god. And of course, in the Greek mythologies, we had the demigods. Well, here's a Mason standing between the 2 pillars. One's the pillar of the sun, one's the pillar of the moon. Which is which? Well, one's darker and one's lighter. It's as simple as that. And if you look in the center of this mural, you can see there's a sun behind his head, just like in the Zoroastrian religion. This is the continuation of the religion in Babylon. This is not the Bible. This is not Judaism, unless you want to say that Judaism is the worship of Nimrod. I mean, Judaism is just a play on an idea, really, because people just kind of assumed that the Jews who didn't, accept Christ as the Messiah in the Bible, they just assumed, oh, well, they're just following the Old Testament. But I've proven time and time again, they're not even following the Old Testament. There's all kinds of details that are just plain out wrong. If you're wondering who this individual is, this is Trayvon Martin's dad. You know, Black Lives Matter, the big movement where everyone sticks up their fist and then makes everyone go on one knee if they're Caucasian. I mean, it's everyone at this point. But I mean, this is Trayvon Martin. This is what started it. It was Michael Brown. He was killed. Trayvon Martin, he was killed. And the next thing you know, people are marching out, putting their fists up and smashing cities. Did you know that came from Freemasonry? And there's 2 sides to Freemasonry, a dark side and a light side. Well, I would suspect then, if it's sun worship, one side, that's the dark side, they'd probably be the side that's getting all these young people to start smashing their cities, all in the name of something that we don't even know if the details are completely straight. Don't believe it? Well, right here. Here's ABC News. Trayvon Martin's parents speak out on political ambitions. This is how manipulative the media is. Notice how he's wearing blue, his wife was wearing red. One is the sun, one is the moon. They came color-coded, dressed up. I see this all the time, and people just scoff at it, but they get programmed by this every day. One represents the masculine, one represents the feminine, one represents electric, one represents magnetic, or if we're paying police, one's good cop, one's bad cop. So again, this is him. This is Tracy Martin, Trayvon Martin's father. Black Lives Matter had a lot to do with the Freemasons. And remember, there's 2 sides, a good and an evil, because you've got daytime, but you've also got nighttime. You've got the sun and you've got the black sun. If we look at Hitler, remember Hitler? Hitler had the swastika. Wasn't the swastika a solar symbol? Didn't the swastika come from Iran? Mithraism shows swastikas all over the place, and that came from Iran. I am Trayvon Martin. Okay, now we have all these people marching around sticking their fist up in the air. Why did the Masons get this movement started where people hold their fist in the air? What does it mean? It must have something to do with the ancient world, must have something to do with the sun and moon. Certainly does. This is Baal. This is Baal from Phoenicia, the Canaanite god. The Phoenicians are the Canaanites. They're also called the Punic people. Notice how Baal always has his sun and has his fist in the air. Why do you think these kids are all raising their fist like that? Why do you think the Black Panthers did it? Here's Nelson Mandela. We've seen this fist before. This fist showed up in Africa. Nelson Mandela was actually a communist. Research that. Here we can see Nelson Mandela, though he's also a Freemason. There's a Nelson Mandela Lodge, by the way. But here we can see we can identify him as a Mason. One, if you see the fist, that should be enough information. But if you don't go with symbols, look at what he's wearing. If we look at the degrees of Freemasonry, walk up the ladder, like Mr. Burns was talking about, I'll climb the ladder. Look at near the top of the ladder. Second from the top, you've got Order of the Temple at the very top, but beneath that, we've got the Order of Malta. Oh, so Nelson Mandela was part of the Knights of Malta. I see them at the Catholic Church sometime. The Maltese Knights, you should recognize that cross. So then Nelson Mandela is a Mason and a communist, and he's put up the fist of Baal. Why would he be doing that? Because we already read in the Masonic Monitor by Duncan that Baal is given to you in the Royal Arch degree. Well, I guess he must have reached the Royal Arch degree. But it gets worse because we talk about a beast in the Bible. We talk about the mark of the beast. Well, look at Nelson Mandela. We've got the 4 and the 4. What's the 4 and the 4 about on either side of the 666? Well, how many sides on a square? 4. So we've got 2 squares. And what's in the center? 666. When you add 666 together, you get 18. And 1 plus 8 is 9. So what we're really looking at is moons and suns. So if we look at a 666, what's the 666 about? Yeah, it's the mark of the beast, but it's the number of the sun. 3 suns. In the Bible, this represents a man that is double-minded. What do you mean a man that's double-minded? A liar. If you're double-minded, it means you're a liar. When you're someone who lies, it means you're someone that acts like beneath a man. You're a beast, right? You're just acting like an animal. An animal will do whatever because an animal doesn't necessarily have higher thinking skills. It doesn't have higher cognitive function. What they're doing is they're using their reputation and their credibility to lie to you, and they put symbols in plain sight. So we see the communist fist, we see the mark of the beast, and then we see the hands up. Why does he have his hands up? Oh, he must be supporting Trayvon Martin. He must be supporting Mike Brown. No. Even the symbol of Black Lives Matter with hands up, don't shoot, since this was Masonic, it goes all the way back to their deity. Remember we studied there was Shamash, that was one child, Moabites, and then the other one was Ben-Ami, the Ammonites. They had 2 gods. Shamash was one god, the other god was Moloch. These are the arms of Moloch. Moloch was associated with child sacrifice. Well, that's scary. Here's a man that everyone thinks was great, and he had to do with a lot of death in Africa because while there was some regime change going on with the communists in Africa, a lot of people died under Nelson Mandela, but those details get swept under the carpet. Well, he's doing a symbol that goes back to this ancient god of child sacrifice. So maybe he is a beast. Maybe he is a liar. Grand Orient, that's the other side of Freemasonry. We talked about the Grand Lodge of England. Those are the real Masons. Those are the Masons that during the First and Second World War, these were your allies during the Second World War. These were the guys that were fighting the evil Hitler. So they're the lesser of 2 evils. Yes, they worship Satan, but they're still the lesser of 2 evils because Satan masquerades as an angel of light. There's Satan, but then there's also the devil. There's 2. So these are your 2 pillars. So the Grand Orient Lodge is the dark side of Freemasonry. You want to find all the dirt on Freemasonry? They're not really Masons, so I say Freemason, but it's not really Masonry. The Grand Orient Lodge, that goes back to Salamanca. That goes back to Italy. And of course, we know during the Second World War, Hitler was getting a lot of power coming from Roman Catholic Church, Italy. And so the communist Masons, their home base, from my understanding of the Salamanca lodges, if you ever hear that during the war that Hitler closed the Masonic lodges, he did. He closed the lodges that went back to England, the Grand Lodge of England. He didn't close the lodges that went back to Italy. Those remained open. So you'll find that around Hitler, there was also Jesuits too, Roman Catholics and Jesuits. And both Masons and Jesuits, they have the same symbol. What is it? The sun. But of course, when we look at Jesuits and Masons, they're like fire and water. If you read about the writings that the Jesuits wrote about the Masons, they were literally trying to exterminate in secret both Protestants and Freemasons because they knew that the Freemasons had a stranglehold over the Protestant church the same way the Jesuits had a stranglehold over the Catholic Church. Catholic, by the way, means universal. So see the thing they have in common? Freemasons called themselves the universal religion, but the word Catholic itself means universalism. So the communist Masons would be your quote unquote evil Masons. And if you want to research them, there's not much you can find because they're very good at covering their tracks. Anthony Fauci was called a Jesuit, which would mean he's secretly a communist. He's secretly a socialist. These are the ones that are manipulating the world today, and people don't even see them. If you take a look at Bolshevism, so in other words, when communism blew up in Russia, you'll find that there is a connection between Bolshevism, communism, Zionism, Judaism. Zionism, that's just an idea that got formulated in Judaism around the 1800s. So to see that Russia had this Bolshevik revolution and you had all these Jews living in Russia, let me point something out. If you know your history, you've got the Caesars, who thought they were God. Then later in time, you had a group that were called the Russian Tsars. You also had the Khazars, which were the Turks very close to Russia. And then you also had the Kaisers in Germany. So this Caesars, Tsars, Kaisers, Khazars, they're all connected. And then we can see that communism was coming from where? Well, Judaism. Because if you understand the religion of the angels, a part of it is very like the communist idea where you have one leader, Satan, and then beneath everyone, you're all brothers working together for a common cause. Get it? That should make sense though, because in Revelation 2:9, God told us so. He said, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. So wait a minute, you're telling me there's Jews in this world that work for Satan? Yes, the Bible tells you so. But I thought the Jews were God's chosen people. Some of them. Some of them rejected their God completely. They were called the Pharisees and Sadducees. Who crucified Christ? The Romans. Who gave the order? The Jews, over a false charge in the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees specifically. So when we look, we can see here these temples, these cathedrals, all across the world, anything connected to sun and moon worship, it all points back to these two pillars from before the flood. Are you sure the Bible's a fairy tale? Every temple that you've probably visited at an ancient site was built in this regard, with either these three doors or two pillars, or they outright just called them the Sun Temple and the Moon Temple. I went on vacation to the Mayan area, and I went to my first temple in Mexico. And when I was there, they made sure to tell me, this is the altar of the sun, it's the altar of the moon. So they had the exact same setup. I'm not surprised whatsoever. If Masonry is the continuation of this universal religion from Babylon that represents the sun, that's only half the equation, right? What about the moon? There's two pillars. So if we're all focused on the moon and the Zoroastrians and that index finger being up, we must be missing half the equation. That's right, you've got the Sadducees. We spent a lot of time talking about the Pharisees, but in the gospel, there was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the Sadducees, you can see they had this lunar horn on top of their head in some images. And you can see they put their hands in this very specific way. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. With one hand, you can see Father, Son, Holy Spirit. With the other hand, look in the image, you can see the sign of the horns. The hand that's pointing down is making the sign of the horns covertly. The hand that's upwards is making what you would think is the sign of benediction. No, that would be the three deities. Sun, moon, and stars, the three stars of Orion, Isis, Horus, and Set, or whatever other name you'd like to give them. But don't you dare call it Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That is a lie. Freemasons and their craft, what Catholics should know. Well, that makes sense. If the Freemasons would be the Pharisees and the Catholics would be the Sadducees, and neither one of them are following the Bible, it's really the sun and moon just fighting against each other. So I'd expect them not to like each other. So we've already identified these are the Sadducees. And the Sadducees are doing the symbol of the moon. And of course, this knowledge of solar and lunar worship came from where? We've already identified it. The Watchers, the angels, Genesis 6:4, Satan and his angels. So in Matthew 16, Christ told us don't follow any of these teachers. Don't follow the Pharisees and their teachings. He called that leaven, because what the Pharisees did, the Pharisees made the Bible impossible for people to follow. They just kept adding rules upon rules upon rules. The Bible has exactly what you need to make it through this life. But what the Pharisees did was they wanted more control. They wanted to judge people. Imagine that. Someone connected to Nimrod, whose symbol was a judge, they wanted to judge you. And we know that the Supreme Court of Israel is extremely judgmental and very hypocritical for that matter. And when Pharisees were judging Christ, they did so in the Sanhedrin, which were the judges. And so these judges, they keep adding so they can be in control. If you make law after law after law after law, well, then you can pretend hypocritically to follow all the laws when you're not doing it. Does that sound like Canada or the US? Do you think you have leaders today that might be influenced by these groups that pretend like they're following all these laws that they make, but in actuality, they're not really following the laws? They just seem like they're great people. They've got these great titles, but every once in a while in the news, oh, someone didn't follow the lockdown orders. And they're doing secret handshakes and symbols just like this, but you don't want to see it. So one side's the sun, one side's the moon, one side believes in the resurrection, the other side doesn't. So which side is the lesser of two evils? The Pharisees. When the sun is in one particular aspect, it's the lesser of two evils. But when the sun goes in the other aspect, it is destructive. The sun burns you. It burns you intellectually. Remember, when the sun, you look at it, it's bright. Bright has been associated to intelligence. So when the sun is burning you, it means the sun is burning you intellectually. They make you look stupid. The other side, the Sadducees or Sadducees, this side here, they don't believe that there's a resurrection. So they don't care what they do. They're the darker side. The darker side, which is getting caught in the news right now, they're getting caught with all these children's bodies. Hey, these Catholic schools and all these children's bodies, what are you guys doing? Well, you're trying to pull up some of our old dirt. Yeah, and eventually what's going to happen is Christians are going to associate the Bible with the horrible atrocities of some of the Sadducees. And what are they going to do? They're going to fall away from the Christian church like Christ said. They're going to think the church is disgusting. They're raping and killing children, and here's the evidence. And then the church will fall away because the Bible is obviously a destructive book for those who don't read it. Now we look at the Morrison triptych. So the triptych word actually came from artwork. It wasn't necessarily defining temples. Artwork were called triptych when they were broken into three pieces. Again, you can see in these triptych paintings, they were hiding the worship of the sun and the moon. On one side, on the left, you see blue. On the other side, you see red. What is that? It's the sun and the moon. What's in the center? Well, that's the Virgin Mary holding Jesus. No, that's Isis holding Horus. Because if you put the sun and the moon on the outside, we know in the center, what do we have? We have the combination of the two. We have the Baphomet. We have the androgyne, transgender. Here's another example at Trinity Chapel altarpiece. Why did they put it at the Trinity Church? Because there is no Trinity. Read Psalms 82, we just did. On the left side, we can see blue. On the right side, we don't see red, we see white. Masons, what they do is in some of their artwork, they'll put red on one side and blue on the other, or they'll put black on one side and white on the other. So blue in this case is black, and white in this case is red. Ah, sun and moon. And if you notice, look at Christ. What's that interesting hand symbol he's doing? It's a lunar symbol. It's the sign of the horns. He's just not extending his index finger all the way up. Okay, so we've got the moon on the right, and then we've got a blue sun. Yep. We've got the red moon and the blue sun. In the center, what do we have here? Well, this would be Christ. Now, how you can tell that this is actually based on the sun and moon, they're playing the opposites game again. The one woman on the left has her hand upwards looking at Christ. The other woman is downwards. So this is, again, left and right, sun and moon, positive and negative. That's the Trinity. That's why they have this piece at the Trinity Church when we know that there is no Trinity. Psalms 82. With the triptych open, the first panel titled Flight into Egypt depicts the birth of Jesus and the beginning of his persecution. Elements within the still life portrait of the flight into Egypt are meant to symbolize the life of Christ and his preaching. The central panel titled The Crucifixion emphasizes Christ's sacrifice for our sins. The black background depicts the moment the sky went dark when Jesus died. John, Mary, Mary Magdalene are present in the painting and are meant to show the reality of the sorrow. The third panel, titled Resurrection, shows Christ's triumph over death and the countryside of Jerusalem in the background. This slight glow around Jesus is meant to show the glorified body of God's Son. The closed triptych portrays Jesus and Mary and Martha at Bethany, from what comes from the motto of Bethany Lutheran College, one thing needful. So wait, if we're looking at this image and it says the far right image is supposed to be after the resurrection, well, didn't Nimrod resurrect to the stars, to the constellation Orion, didn't he? Wasn't he a mighty hunter? Wasn't he a king? Do you know how the king got the crown? Because he killed a big animal. He wore the horns of the animal on his head. Now do you understand who Christ is? You can say he's Tammuz, Osiris, Nimrod, pick a sun god, doesn't matter. So what they're doing here with showing you the sign of the horns is they're equating Christ to Tammuz or Nimrod. It's horrible. So on one side, we see the horns, the lunar horns. On the other side, we see the sun. Strange configuration, because depending on the occult, if you're a Sadducee or a Pharisee, the Sadducees might look at it like this. The Sadducees might say, okay, we've got a blue sun and we've got a red moon. And the Pharisees might say, well, we have a red sun and a blue moon, which sounds like the most, normal kind of way to look at it. Universalism, because that's what this is all about. Universalism is a philosophical and theological concept that has ideas, universal application or applicability. This is the universal religion. It's not just called Babylon. There are religions out there where they just say it's the ecumenical movement, ecumenical meaning universal. Masonry is a universal religion, or any religions where they think they all kind of come together. What universalism is a belief in one fundamental truth is another important tenet in universalism. The living truth is seen as far more reaching than the natural, cultural, religious boundaries or interpretation of that one truth. As the Rig Veda states, Hinduism, truth is one. Sages call it by various names. A community that calls itself universalist may emphasize the universal principles of most religions and sect others in an inclusive manner. I see. So we're supposed to be inclusive of all the religions and bring them all together. But if only one religion tells you the truth, and the rest are just a bunch of lies that came from Babylon that are combined together, I don't really care to see everything be inclusive. If I'm saying that inclusion is based on lies, I'd rather have the truth. If we look at the Adelaide Masonic Lodge, again, we see the triptych, just like in the paintings, the 1, 2, and 3, where the center is that middle pillar. That's where they put Christ. In other words, this is the religion of the false Christ. On the outsides are the sun and moon. It's the same thing that we saw in Mexico. When we looked at this is the Temple of Jaguar. It's the same thing we saw with Da Vinci's picture of the Last Supper. We don't know how many windows were behind Christ, and neither did Da Vinci. Da Vinci drew these 3 windows because it represents these 3 pillars, or the sun and the moon, and then the androgyne in the center. Wait a minute, are you telling me that Christ is a male-female? Look at his face. Da Vinci drew a woman with a beard. And if you look on the left side, look at this. This is supposed to be the Apostle John. The Apostle John's wearing green and red. Why does John look like a blonde woman? And we can see on the other side, we can see that index finger. The index finger represents Jupiter, and Jupiter in the Bible is supposed to be Satan. So this picture was not depicting Christ at the Last Supper. This was depicting the Trinity. That was in Egypt, Hinduism, in India. This goes back to Babylon. This goes back to before the flood. This is all leading people to believe that eventually we're going to unify our religions. And that's like the Baha'i faith. The Baha'i faith is actually teaching that we have these different prophets, and Islam actually teaches the same thing. They taught that Christ was a prophet, and there'll be another prophet called the Mahdi after him. And each subsequent prophet becomes better and better and better until they finally have their final revelation of their final prophet. This is how they're going to try to unify all the religious books together. Cambridge University also teaches this. It's called perennialism and the religious experience. It's called the perennial philosophy. The term perennialism has multiple meanings. According to one definition, it is a form of religious pluralism. Specifically, it's the view that there is a shared core of truth in all major religions. sometimes called the perennial philosophy, and that this core is grounded in and justified by shared religious experiences, usually of a mystical variety. Oh, you mean like the third eye? That's pretty mystical. In a narrower sense, it is the view that certain types of mystical or other religious experiences are essentially the same. This sounds like Masonry. The perennial philosophy just sounds like a synonym for the universal religion of Masonry from Babylon through Nimrod. Phenomenologically speaking, in all or almost all human cultures and religious traditions, broad perennialism has a long history dating all the way back to ancient times. Ancient like Babylon? It is still taken seriously, especially by those who regard themselves as spiritual but not religious. See, look, you don't have to believe in the Bible. You don't have to believe in religion at all. This is a spiritual science. So when they start to show you meditation and how you can meditate and you can be spiritual without being religious because it's scientific, you can feel smart about it. Maybe they'll even tell you it's quantum mechanics. Maybe they'll even call it quantum physics because physics sounds like math. So you don't have to be offended by math, right? The perennial philosophy was actually not coined by Aldous Huxley, but used quite a bit by Aldous Huxley, author of a very famous book, Brave New World. If you look at the front cover of this Aldous Huxley publication of the perennial philosophy on the right, you'll see different religious emblems, symbols, idols, etc. So you can clearly tell without even opening a page of the book, you know what it has to do with. It's blending all the religions together, and clearly Hinduism's in there. You can see Hinduism and Buddhism clearly. And you can tell it has something to do with the sun. Because on the left-hand side, you can see the sun rising above the horizon. Horus, the horizon. Didn't the book of Ezekiel say that people would turn their back on God and they'd start to worship the sun? That must be the universal religion that came from Babylon. Universalism. In the Catholic Church, it's called the ecumenical movement. That's why they have Islam and Buddhists and Hindus all coming to pray together. Sounds beautiful, but if it's based on the worship of Satan, it's stupid. Hinduism, the perennial philosophy, that is the core of all religions. Well, if Babylon made its way into the Indus Valley through the Aryans, well, then I guess whatever the Hindus were teaching will be the same thing taught in Babylon, which means all the religions that scattered from Babylon, they'd all be part of the perennial philosophy. Defining esotericism from a Masonic perspective. Esotericism, the mention of the word fills the mind with some notions of beautiful and ancient truths and inspires them with curiosity about the inner meaning of the craft, Masonry. For others, the term brings to mind unpleasant and tiresome lectures, awash in insipid, unlikely, and artificial interpretations of Masonry. And for most, it is a word only semi-familiar, having something to do vaguely with mysticism and Masonic secrets. The word esoteric by itself simply means something which is understood by only a select or chosen inner group. So in other words, the word esoteric means understood by a few people. Things like automotive repair or tax law might be called esoteric. Maybe building temples, or maybe weaving clothing, or the art of music and geometry. Maybe that would be esoteric to Jubal and Jabal. Freemasons have used the word in different and more traditional sense. It turns out that esotericism is nothing new. The word itself comes to us from the Greek word esoterikos, inner thing, and is found in many ancient writings to refer to the inner teachings of a philosophical or spiritual group. The popularity of Western esotericism among today's Masonic candidates cannot be ignored. Today's Masonic candidates should not be ignored. The literal truth of these myths is beside the point. In other words, don't read the Bible for what it says. Read it symbolically, and then you'll find the esoteric, the inner meaning that we know. For the most part, those who study Western esotericism today do not believe the legendary histories word for word. In other words, don't read the Bible literally. You might think Christ actually died on the cross and resurrected, and that doesn't fit with our sun worship. Instead, they tend to be deeply attracted to the uplifting values of the perennial philosophy. So esotericism, what Masonry is into, is the same thing that Aldous Huxley was into, which is all the religions of the world combined together in this universal idea. Values are Masonic forebears, often understood and promoted. This is a Masonic publication called The Northern Light. The Northern Light, what's north? If we talk about north as in cardinal directions, Well, we could be talking about somewhere like, I don't know, Alaska, or somewhere up farther like Antarctica or the North Pole. But if we're talking northern light in regards to the temple, maybe we're talking about the sky. What's north? Is that the eye of Lucifer? Here it says Freemasonry in a view of the perennial world philosophy. And here's an article on it. You can read it sometime. The link's on the bottom. But let me just show you an excerpt. Notice here on the right-hand side, this book that they're showing you. It has this symbol. It looks like a bunch of circles connected together. Do you know where that came from? Egypt, from the Temple of Osiris. It's called, we've studied it, the seed of life, or the flower of life in this particular configuration. In conclusion, well-ordered writing, imagery, footnotes, poetry, addenda, and explications are results of the 30-plus years of Masonic experience. Okay, so the guy who wrote this book, 30 years as a Mason. He must know something. Backing Heinmiller's work. Furthermore, as a particular work, it reveals some of the mechanics of our beautiful craft in both an operative and speculative way that compels further reading. It is equally exoteric and esoteric, so understood by people on the outside and by a hidden few on the inside. Perhaps the only thing that could improve the work is the hardbound format for those adverse to reading on devices and further editing for future editions. Wow, that's a pretty good plug. This book was so good. The only thing they didn't like about it was in a digital format. So the idea of a universal religion is obviously completely compatible with Masonry. And if Masonry heralds itself all the way back to Nimrod and before, well, didn't Nimrod build the Tower of Babel? Wasn't that the original universal religion? Isn't that why we see all these temples across the world have this 3 design? 1 door, 2 door, 3 door, and then a sun, a moon, and then, of course, host of heaven. Ye shall know the truth. Christianity and the perennial philosophy. I'm sorry, these do not fit. Unless you read the Bible like a pagan, you cannot make this fit. Aldous Huxley had a book called The Doors, and the bullseye was actually a symbol for the sun. And here we see the doors, where he writes the word door, we get the Vesica Pisces. That's a religious symbol. It says, the doors of perception includes heaven and hell. Didn't we say that heaven and hell overlap with each other? Isn't that really what the Vesica Pisces is showing you? So you're telling me that people that know how to meditate or do drugs are able to access Eden? If you take a look at the Vatican, you can see here where the big obelisk is from Egypt. When you actually draw 2 circles, what do you see? It sits right in the center of the Vesica Pisces. If you look at the Washington Monument from a bird's eye view, they actually drew the Vesica Pisces on the ground at the Washington Monument. Wonder what Aldous Huxley was into. Why do you cover your right eye like that? That looks like the book of Zechariah. Woe to the worthless shepherd. Remember, there was a shepherd. Remember before the flood, Jabal, he carried in the work of Abel. He was a shepherd. Well, the Bible says there's a worthless shepherd, a shepherd that's going to desert the flock. Why would the shepherd desert the flock? Well, because remember, you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. One side meditates, one side does drugs. One side is the lesser of 2 evils, one side is evil. One side is getting caught with their children's bodies in Canada. What's going to happen is these people that are exposing them, once they are done shepherding you and you don't choose their God, they're just going to leave. How do they leave? They meditate. So in other words, once the storm comes, once you finally get your head out of your butt and you realize the world is going into a very dark place, the only people that were left to shepherd you, who weren't even serving God at all, they will meditate and they will leave before the killing starts. And they will leave all of you to deal with the wolves. That's why the shepherd is worthless. David, he watched over his sheep even when times got tough. These shepherds, they will meditate out of here. That's why for years you've heard all these stories about people joining cults. And then one day the spaceship would come and then they would join up with the mothership. That's what this was all alluding to. People who would one day meditate, and when the time was right, they would leave their body and they would leave us all here while the wolves closed in. And the wolves are people. They're covering their right eye because it's the eye of the sun. The eye of the sun is on the right. The eye of the moon is on the left. The one that's going to come to kill us someday are the ones that cover their left eye. This goes back to Astarte. You've got Satan. Satan in the Bible is the lesser of 2 evils. He's the angel that appears to be righteous. Then we have evil, and evil in the Bible is depicted as a woman. It's the whore of Babylon. She's the one that comes to cut off your heads. She's the one in Revelation that takes the heads off of the saints. When the false shepherds leave, they will leave us with her and her followers, and they will destroy. This is why in Star Wars you had the forces of light and the forces of darkness. The Star Wars series was based on Zoroastrianism. George Lucas will tell you so. They're covering their right eye because the Jedi are the good guys. The ones that cover their left eye are the dark Sith, the sinful ones, the moon worshippers. That's why in all these Star Wars posters you would see this. And here you see Madonna. But Madonna is covering her right eye too. But remember, there's a light sun and there's a dark sun. This is mother sun. One sun is associated to the mother, one sun is associated to the father. This would be the bad sun. She's doing the same symbol as Horus, but Horus was a falcon-headed male. This is a woman. She's wearing a shirt that says Kabbalists do it better, which means you know she studies Kabbalah. So the symbols that she's doing would make sense to someone who practiced Kabbalah or Zoroastrianism, sun worship. Madonna is really the dark side of the moon. Madonna is the Black Madonna. While all these ones are the good guys are the ones covering their right eye. Madonna would be the one that covers the other eye. She is the whore. And if you see here, she is the solar goddess. As a matter of fact, let me just close the slide for a sec so I don't lose this. I want to get you the quote here. The quote says, "I believe what I practice has to do with something deeper than religion that embodies all religions, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam." So a Madonna, a Kabbalist, subscribes to the universal religion, the same universal religion as the Masons, the same universal religion as the Pharisees. But while one covers one eye, the other is actually associated to the other eye, because Satan counterfeits God and the devil counterfeits Satan. It's that tricky. So she's impersonating Christ, except not Christ in the same way as the Pharisees did, not the false Christ. She is the Antichrist. She is the whore. You can see it how she always sits with her legs open. She represents the whore. She does not represent Christ. Remember, the woman holds the child. She is not the child, which means she must be the woman. And if you notice behind her chair, you're thinking, oh, it says Madonna. That's why there's an M there. The constellation of Orion is also depicted as an M or a W. It depends on how you look at it. So when Madonna has these horns on top of her head, and you see this symbol where she pretends like she's a Christian, she's not the mother, she's the whore. And the whore is depicting herself as transgender. That's why Madonna has always pushed the boundaries of sexuality, where she tried to look like she was a girl dressed up like a boy. It goes back to this symbol. This is Aphrodite. This is Venus. This is the dark side of Venus. Remember, Lucifer is a god of light and darkness. It's a star that goes above and below. Remember, the evening star, the morning star, that's what you're looking at here. Madonna is not Christ. She is the Antichrist. When you look at her, she's actually emulating this transgender deity. You've got the horns on the head, one hand up, one hand down, like the Baphomet, one hand up, one hand down, and then the devil in tarot, one hand up, one hand down. Madonna calls herself Madam X now, and now all of a sudden she's wearing an eye patch on her left eye. The left eye is the eye of the moon. And I guess that's why you're coming onto stage with bulls. One represents the mother, one represents the child. Do you see it? Madonna is now Madam X. I'm going to cover my left eye now. I'm on the side of the lunar cult. You see, when you're in the lunar cult, you mix truth with lie. Truth would be the right eye. Lies would be the left eye. She switched eyes. That means she switched from one side to the other. When you look at the old pictures of the Baphomet, it's going to explain to you where the dunce's cap came from. If you look at the right-hand side, here's the Baphomet, here's the Knights Templar. The Baphomet has a cross on his chest. If you look in the corner, you'll see an X, which is a Phoenician Tau. Notice it's in the corner. When you were a bad child, they made you sit in the corner, and you had to wear a hat that was a pointed hat. The reason why is because the hat represents a magician's cap. It's like Merlin's cap. The Masons practiced magic. So the Knights Templar, they took on the symbol of the cross because they were the white magicians. They were the ones who were the false Christs. They did good, like the Pharisees, kind of, and they thought that they were God. The ones who sit in the corner, they're the witches who practice black magic, and they're selfish. And that's why children in Europe, they had to wear the dunce's cap because they were the black magicians who were acting up in school, the class clown. Stephen King's It. Now when you take a look and you see Madonna and you look at the witch and then you look at the dunce's cap, you can figure it out. This is Madam X. The X represents the children that sit in time out. Because when you go to hell, you're sitting in time out. This is the whore, but the whore dresses up like she's a queen. If you look on the left-hand side, this is Venus, Aphrodite, Diana Lucifera. The name Lucifer is coming from this left-hand image here. The full name was Diana Lucifera, and she was in the New Testament. She was Diana of Ephesus. And you can tell that Diana of Ephesus, when the people worship this goddess and they become corrupted, it becomes violent. Because when John went to Ephesus, when Paul went to Ephesus, they nearly tore him apart limb from limb. The people started screaming, Artemis is great, Artemis is great. Other translations said, Diana is great, Diana is great. Diana is Diana Lucifera. When Lucifer or Diana becomes a dark goddess, when she becomes the dark mother Kali, she will rip you apart limb from limb. So here's the difference. Aldous Huxley, he's the sun, he's the Pharisee. Madonna, Seduci, she's the moon. Remember, Seducis go back to where? Roman Catholicism. And Madonna was a Roman Catholic. So it totally makes sense why she would be not aligned with the Masons, but instead aligned with the darker side of Catholicism. You could call her a dark Jesuit. That's why she keeps depicting herself on the cross. She pretends like she's Christ, but of course we know she's not. She calls herself the Virgin, right? Madonna is the Virgin. So she's actually claiming transgenderism with the symbol. She dresses up like the sun, but she's a woman who calls herself Madonna, which means she's the Virgin. She's using a transgender symbol. And again, she denotes herself as the queen, or at least the whore. Take a look. She holds the Virgin Mary. She knows it's not the Virgin Mary. She's literally wearing a bra with the Virgin Mary in front of her cleavage. She knows she's a prostitute. And if you look, you can see around her chain, or around her neck, a whole bunch of crosses. The ones who follow the whore of Babylon, they're the ones who wear the cross. I repeat, the ones who follow the whore of Babylon, they wear the cross. So if you see rappers and all these people doing heinous things on TV, but when they come onto the music awards, they're always wearing their cross. They represent the whore, the liars. Look at her concert. Here's the cross, and Madonna is literally stepping on a half-naked nun. If you can't figure out, she represents not the queen, but the whore. It's obvious. They're just taking pagan symbols and flipping them upside down. She pretends to be the queen from the book of Jeremiah, but really, she's the prostitute of Revelation. Again, you can tell this goes back to solar worship. They made sure that the one with light skin had a rub-on tattoo, maybe it's a real tattoo, of the sun. The sun was associated to the prostitute. This is the whore of Babylon. She has 3 nuns up there that are in plain view by the pole because they're trying to do the same thing with the 3 pillars and the middle pillar being the cross, which is in line with Madonna, the sun. This is why you see the Tower of Babel in Europe. This European Parliament building we've already discussed, it is the Tower of Babel, and Europe or Europa goes right back to the whore of Babylon. We've looked and we've seen that they're trying to recreate backwards what happened in Genesis. If people in Genesis were scattered because they had one language that was confused, in Europe, what are they trying to do? Bring it all together under one tongue. They are inverting what happened in Genesis 11 while they actually build the Tower of Babel right in front of you. When they depict this woman, Europa, they always show you her riding on a bull. And the reason is because in Revelation, you have the whore that rides the beast. The beast represents the state. The whore represents the false church. And this is why Europe is trying to bring everyone together. They're trying to bring all the religions together under Rome. The Pope someday is going to try to make this universal religion. It's going to be the Garden of Eden 2.0. In other words, the deception of the serpent. That's why we have this new slogan in Europe. Why is it shaped like a pentagram with all the religions? Europe for all. You mean Lucifer for all? You're talking about the whore of Babylon. You're talking about the negative aspect of Venus. Europe is the continuation of Babylon. And Israel is the continuation of Babylon as well. But Babylon had a confusing religion, lunar and solar. Europe or Europa means wide and broad. In Matthew, Christ told us, don't take the broad road. In other words, you want to find out how to go to destruction? Europe is the way to get there. They're taking the broad path. The Pharisees may not be leading you to heaven either, but if you want to make sure you find destruction, follow what the Europeans are teaching. The red light districts. Who am I in the Bible? This is the wide gate. This is the prostitute of Revelation 17. Who am I in the Bible? Why are you so amazed, said the angel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. We're talking about Aphrodite. We're talking about how Rome split. Rome split and later became the Holy Roman Empire. And today, you are all citizens of it. And today, they are trying to get you to follow in their path. You see the red on the one side and the blue on the other. What's the red and blue about? One is the sun, one is the moon. What's in the center? Aphrodite. So she's androgynous. Yes. She represents the false Christ. They just put a beard on her. In Rome, you can see her too. St. Peter's Basilica. This is supposed to be Peter, but it's not Peter. Look at this hand symbol he's doing. It's the same as the Baphomet. He's got the 2 fingers up. The fingers represent Jupiter and Saturn. And then what is he sitting on top of? The clamshell. Well, isn't Aphrodite on top of the clamshell? So that means that Peter in the Vatican is actually Aphrodite. He's Jupiter Aphrodite. I'll finish with Christ as my savior. Through this chaotic situation called life, we may finally learn that it was a better idea to put our faith in God than in men.
That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.